In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and video media online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com. The Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from the Strip and Flip selection, as opposed to election, of 2016, 5 Jim Crows and Electronic Election Theft by Bob Fitrakis and Harvey Wasserman. This is from the chapter Part 1, page 15, Strip. The foundation of election theft is the manipulation of race as a divide-and-conquer strategy. It began with the first Jim Crow chattel slavery. Slavery in various forms has existed since the dawn of time, but in the colonies of British North America and then in the United States, it took on a uniquely virulent incarnation. Chattel slavery was, of course, a horrific, brutal labor system designed primarily in the American South to power a network of plantations that produced cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, and other hot weather crops that could be grown in large fields. But it had a larger purpose here. Our peculiar institution, how the founders referred to slavery, was meant to divide black laborers from white in a system that would guarantee that they would never unite in rebellion. As we'll see, this originated with the infamous Bacon's Rebellion of 1675 in Virginia. Servants of both races joined forces. Plantation owners vowed to make sure that that never happened again. When the United States became an independent country, plantation owners also vowed to secure political benefits from their slaves. Thus, they wrote into the Constitution the 3/5 clause that gave slave owners additional representation for their slaves, even though those slaves could not vote. That additional vote count guaranteed that every president from Jefferson to Lincoln either owned slaves or his vice president did, and that the Congress was strongly controlled by slave owners right up to the outbreak of the Civil War. After the Civil War, with formal slavery abolished, a Jim Crow system of racial segregation overtook the South. Enforced by the Democratic Party and its Ku Klux Klan terror wing, white landowners updated the realities of slavery, blacks and whites apart. The roots of racism since 1865 has been the treatment of legally freed African Americans as something less than human, guaranteeing all whites a sense of superiority and an economic leg up. When the populist and socialist movements that campaigned most powerfully from the 1880s to the 1920s worked to overcome this separation, they were hammered by the court and electoral systems through a series of stolen elections and twisted race-based legal decisions, and the fusion of the Democratic and Republican parties in the 1917 municipal races in the Northeast. Confirmed by the Supreme Court in the 1890s, this updated Jim Crow caste system again guaranteed that blacks in the South and parts of the North would not be allowed to vote, and that they would be carefully divided from whites by caste as well as class. Since 1970, the primary weapon for suppressing the minority vote has been the third Jim Crow, the drug war. In the tradition of Bacon's Rebellion and the populist socialist upheavals, blacks and whites once again began to unite during the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1950s and 60s. In response, Richard Nixon's Republican Party invoked the divide-and-conquer war on drugs. Confronted with the liberalization of the Southern Democratic Party, Nixon feared that black votes might remake America's political map. In Republican eyes, there was only one solution: disenfranchise the African-American population, along with young and Latino voters who were leaning strongly to the left. In 1972, Nixon pointedly ignored a powerful report from his own Blue Ribbon Schaefer Commission on drug use and escalated the attack on marijuana and other drugs. In the 45 years since, a staggering 41 million Americans have been arrested for pot or other controlled substances. That's a number of human beings that exceeds the populations of more than 150 other countries worldwide. It has left the United States with the largest prison population in the history of the modern world, while having little or no impact on the actual use of drugs. As Michelle Alexander has shown in her landmark book, The New Jim Crow, the majority of those incarcerated have been black and Latino, with a devastating impact on our elections. Millions of these mostly young, mostly male citizens have been stripped of their right to vote, as well as their ability to maintain families, obtain work, and meaningfully participate in the political lives of their communities. All this has been by design. Once again, new Jim Crow policy has been delegated by a ruling elite to strip our non-white population of its ability to exercise its fair share of power in our electoral process and to unite with whites in political action. In the 1890s, rising industrial interests committed the nation to a fourth Jim Crow, a course of race-based global empire. The U.S. already had a history of foreign intervention, dating to Thomas Jefferson's 1803 use of our fledgling Navy to fight pirates along the coast, the shores of Tripoli, of what's now called Libya. That was followed by the North American continent with genocidal warfare used against indigenous peoples who had lived here for 20,000 years. By the 1890s, when the frontier consumed, America's giant corporations began to expand overseas. They started with Hawaii, a constitutional monarchy, and then pushed into Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and beyond. And in all cases, these interventions involved the white-ruled U.S. interfering with systems in non-white countries. In discussing this fourth Jim Crow, we include an extensive, though not complete, list of these interventions. It underscores the reality that our own political system has become an imperial juggernaut, the inevitable blowback bound to obliterate any residual pretense to real democracy at home. Generally, there's been an attempt to portray these interventions as benign, meant to bring democracy, progress, and the Christian faith to third world nations. In fact, they've been largely economic in purpose, a dollar democracy to grab other people's resources. The strip and
the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, happy Monday, happy Martin Luther King Day, but in Mississippi and Alabama, of course, it's Robert E. Lee Day. Honest to God, the traitor who declared war against the United States is being honored today in Mississippi and Alabama. Amazing. We got a lot to talk about today. Martin Luther King wanted to end poverty and legal discrimination. I just want to talk a little bit about his legacy. Algernon Austin is going to be with us in the second hour, starting the second with the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. Previously director of that institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, to talk about some of the things that Dr. King was working on and advocating for at the time of his death that still are undone. I want to get into House Republicans playing with fire on our economy. We'll get into that today. Also, it's always been about control. A brilliant posting over on Mastodon I'll share with you about men and, well, yeah, largely men and women and abortion. In the second hour, as I mentioned, Algernon Austin is going to drop by. Also, is Ron DeSantis running for president on the bodies of Florida women? It's increasingly appearing that way. A message went out to pharmacies across the state. Well, I'll tell you about that in the second hour. In the third hour of the program, as long as the Republicans use race as a political weapon, we're going to see hate crimes intensify. This is just a grim story. Actually, a whole series of grim stories about what's going on in the United States right now, because in large part of, in my opinion, because Donald Trump and the Republican Party, really starting with Nixon's Southern strategy. I mean, obviously this goes back 400 years in this continent, but in the modern era, explicitly, a political party explicitly embracing racism, the Republican Party starting with the, with Nixon's Southern strategy and going forward. We'll talk about that in the third hour. And Russia has stolen 700,000 Ukrainian children. Where's QAnon when you need them? So we got a lot to talk about today. Just to begin, as I mentioned, it is Martin Luther King Day today. And thanks to new books, this is Carlos Guillermo Smith over on Twitter. Thanks to new books pushed by Ron DeSantis, the GOP Florida legislature, books about Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are being banned in Florida school districts. Among the rejected titles are a book about Martin Luther King Jr. intended for fourth graders, a biography of Rosa Parks for second grade classrooms, a first grade Berenstain Bears book about God, and multiple titles including gay, lesbian, and trans characters and families. Yeah, welcome to the brave new world of Republican politics. On Martin Luther King Day, they are aggressively banning books about Martin Luther King down in Florida and in multiple other states as well. Tom Cotton recently talking, he was, this is, actually I'm going to get into this I think in some more detail in the third hour, but I'll just give you a preview. Republicans are using King's words to justify their own racism, essentially. Tom Cotton was grilling military officers before the Senate, and he said, why can't we replay Martin Luther King Jr.'s content of a character and not the color of his skin speech? He said that in the context of diversity training in the military. He doesn't want there to be any. So instead of diversity training, says Senator Tom Cotton, he's from Alabama, isn't he? Where they're celebrating Robert E. Lee Day, I think. Let me just double check. I tossed that. Yeah, Alabama. No, he's from Arkansas. Yeah, okay, I got the wrong state. Anyway, Dan Rather posted an absolutely fascinating piece. Dan Rather started covering the White House in 1962. I actually started covering Martin Luther King in 1962. Became the official White House correspondent for CBS News in 1964. And in '64, he was one of the moderators of Face the Nation, Dan Rather was. And they had Dr. Martin Luther King on as a guest. And Rather asked him, and I find this absolutely fascinating. Dan Rather said, do you think there's a real danger of the Republican Party? Now keep in mind, '64, this was 4 years before Richard Nixon declared the Southern Strategy. And yet, this was the year that they passed the Civil Rights Act, and you know, there was significant Democratic opposition from the South, but there was also substantial Republican opposition. So anyhow, Dan Rather asked Martin Luther King, do you think there's a real danger of the Republican Party becoming the white man's party in this country? And King answers, and I quote, I think there is a real danger. I've talked with some Negro Republicans who are very concerned about this. I see trends and developments which will reveal that unless the liberals of the Republican Party take a much more decisive role in leadership positions, this will become a white man's party. And I think this will be tragic for that Republican Party, as well as tragic for the nation. Dan Rather goes on to note that in '68, you know, you've got the Southern Strategy, Reagan demonizing welfare queens, George H.W. Bush's Willie Horton ads, et cetera. And back in August of last year, Dan Rather had tweeted, make no mistake, if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, he would be stigmatized as woke and attacked accordingly. Today, Rather is writing, everything Dr. King stood for is under attack in America today. You can see it in the efforts to disenfranchise voters. You can find it in the whitewashing of history and the demonization of so-called critical race theory. Whether it's the banning of books, attacks on labor rights, or the death knell of affirmative action. An America of ideas, engagement, and reckoning with our past is under siege. In the sneers at wokeness, Dan Rather writes, one finds an effort by the privileged to hold on to the positions of power they feel they are owed, and I would add, by virtue of the color of their skin. It is an insult, Rather writes, to everything Dr. King hoped to achieve. So here we are. What does this mean to you? What does Martin Luther King mean, his legacy, this holiday, what does this mean to you? And how does America go forward, reconciling with our racial past, and particularly in the face of Republican efforts to block even the discussion of America's racial past in our public schools? I think these are really huge and substantial issues. I think this issue has not only not gone away, but the Republicans planning, you know, as they're preparing for the 2024 presidential election, are putting it front and center. The whole wokeness thing is really an attack on about American history, in large part. We'll be right back. It's coming up on, well, it's 14 minutes past.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. I'll be right back. And welcome back, Ed in Erie, Michigan. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I know today's probably should be a different subject, but I want to talk about, I talked to your screener. She said she'd check out, see if it was okay. But about cars, because last week you mentioned you got a new electric car, right?
Yeah, I did. I got a Hyundai Ioniq 5.
Okay. Well, now, don't cut me off now or nothing, but, okay, now I'm 1,000% in on electrics. I'm waiting myself for, you know, Chrysler to start coming out with more because I'm a Jeep retiree. You know, and but
you realize Chrysler's owned by a French company now, isn't it?
About these, pardon me?
Chrysler's owned by a French company now, but go ahead.
Yeah. It's Stellantis. You know, we were owned by so many. I started out with American Motors and Renault, and
I remember it well.
But you know.
Yeah, Mitt Romney's dad was in the middle of all that. I remember it, growing up in Michigan.
Jeep was always the money. And
so
then,
what's your point? Where are you going with this?
Oh, okay, all right. After the Republican depression of 2008, okay, all the American automakers had to this day, it was half of what I made, Tom.
Yeah, I know. GM dropped their starting pay from $24 an hour to $14 an hour, if my recollection serves me correctly.
Okay, now where I'm going with it is, you know, I wish you'd give it just a little bit of consideration. I know the plant's got to come first. I realize that. Okay, but there are some union, at least from union companies. Not every car that Chrysler or Ford or Chevy makes is made in the United States, but they're higher payers and pension payers and health care payers, where all the transplants, as we call them, Honda, Toyota, you know, all the rest of them down there, down south, are not. And that is part of Ronald Reagan's, you know, I'm with you. To me, you know, I was one of the young people, okay, in 1981 when I didn't even have 10 years in there yet. Okay, I hired in 73. Young man going nuts. When Reagan fired them air traffic controllers, okay, thinking something was going to happen, none. And it didn't. Okay, we were waiting for the truckers. That was the first. The Teamsters were supposed to shut down first and then have one-day work stoppages. I was there in the labor movement when that happened. Right. They did because, okay, so, yeah, but that one of his strategies, Tom, was building them plants down there because he knew they would be non-union. And
they were right to work for less states.
Exactly. So, because you're not the only one. And now I donate to the television side of your program.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ed. So basically, we're going to hit a break here in just a second, Ed. It sounds like what you're saying is I should have bought an American-made car because I would be supporting American labor, and I don't disagree with that. The decision that every person has to make is what part of a company's policies are you going to base your purchasing decision on? You know, are you going to base it on their decision to make a good car, or are you going to base it on their decision to have good labor practices? And now
I take a little bit of offense at that because, but wait a minute, because the American cars are good too. Okay.
Yeah, I don't disagree. They're not, but
so please don't do that. Okay, all right. Thank you for
listening. I got to run, Ed, but I get it, and I'll take that criticism. It's I don't see any perfect decisions here. We'll be right back.
Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com.
Wondering what this new legislative session, the next 2 years, are going to bring us with Republicans in charge of the House of Representatives? Well, Congressman Bill Pascrell put together a list that kind of summarizes what we should expect. 100% of the Republicans in the House of Representatives voted against cheaper gas for Americans, voted against cheaper insulin for Americans, voted against cheaper prescription drug prices, 100% voted against child tax credits, 100% voted against stimulus checks, 100% voted against the Voting Rights Act. They voted 100% voted against ending gerrymandering. They voted 100% against ending climate change. 100% voted against prosecuting rich tax cheats. 100% voted against saving Roe v. Wade. 99% voted against banning assault weapons or fighting domestic terrorism. The list goes on. I've got an entire video all about the entire list over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. So my rant today, my daily take over at HartmannReport.com is titled "House Republicans Are Playing with Fire in with our economy." And it's not just that they're playing with fire. It's that the fire that they're playing with could be World War III. And you know, there's a couple of important points that or what I think are important points that I'm making in this op-ed today. The first is that we're about to hit our debt ceiling, right? It's going to happen on Thursday of this week. Now, Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, is going to be able to move money around and pause things and change things so that maybe we can get through June without going into default. But she's warning the House Republicans that they are playing with fire. And, you know, they're perfectly willing to do it. And there's a couple of reasons. The first reason that House Republicans are willing to do this is because the billionaires who finance them hate paying income taxes. And even though they only pay 2 or 3% of their income in taxes, most billionaires in America, you know, they want to make sure that if the day ever comes when we actually start taxing billionaires at the same rate that you and I pay taxes, that most of the social programs are gone, so their taxes will be low. I mean, you know, they don't make any bones about this. Everybody understands this. So first, the House Republicans think this is going to help them politically because the billionaires will throw more money at them. I mean, whenever you have a financial crisis, while it wipes out working families, divorce, suicide, homelessness, poverty, all that stuff, they're great buying opportunities for the morbidly rich. The Great Depression was when some of the greatest fortunes in America were made because rich people had money and they could buy up distressed assets. Warren Buffett made $35 billion on a $5 billion investment in Bank of America back in 2008 when George W. Bush crashed the economy. Second, though, and I think this is more important, House Republicans have no sense of history. This goes back to Arnold Toynbee's statement, you know, that when the last man who remembers the horrors of the last great war dies, the next great war becomes inevitable. Those those countries whose leaders fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat the lessons of history. This is, you know, I've talked about this before, Strauss and Howe's book, The Fourth Turning and all this sort of thing. You know, 80 years after the Revolutionary War, we had the Civil War. Well, it was the crash of 1700 followed by the Revolutionary War. 80 years after the crash of 1857, followed by the Civil War. That was 80 years later. Then 80 years after that, we had the crash of 1929, followed by World War II. And we are now 2 years short of 80 years after the end of World War II. And I think it's a real important point to make that if the Republicans succeed in throwing the United States into debt, into default, throwing our debt into default, which it appears that they are fully intending to do. There was a piece in the Washington Post over the weekend talking about how they think they've got a strategy to kind of walk us through this in a way that won't have too much fallout, right? Which is complete BS. The moment that you declare that our debt is in default, asset managers all around the world are just going to start running in the other direction. There's a reason why the dollar and the U.S. Treasuries are literally at the core of the entire world's international financial system. And that reason is that the United States has never defaulted on its debt. And if Republicans can throw us into default, it will produce a second Republican Great Depression, like the 1930s. Now, what happened during the 1930s? That Republican Great Depression that was caused by Republicans right here in the United States. Herbert Hoover, well, actually, it was Warren Harding, having deregulated Wall Street in 1921, led right to the crash while Hoover was president in 1929, in October of 29. So what came out of that? What came out of that was Mussolini, Tojo, and Hitler all deciding that the West was so weakened by this economic crisis that they could use that weakness, they could use that crisis as an opportunity, in the Tojo's case, to invade China, in Hitler's case, to invade Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria, the Anschluss, and which led us straight to World War II. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if these Republicans, if these House Republicans throw us into a second Republican Great Depression, which they are proclaiming they are perfectly willing to do, if they don't get big cuts in Social Security, Medicare, the Environmental Protection Agency, food stamps, aid to education, they want all that stuff cut. Over $100 billion in cuts the Republicans are demanding, with no tax increases and no closing tax loopholes and no cuts to defense spending. If Democrats won't go along with that, Republicans are saying they will crash our economy. And if they crash our economy, and that depression goes worldwide, as it will, we are the largest economy in the world. You know, the old saying in Japan used to be, when America catches a cold, Japan gets the flu, or America sneezes, Japan catches a cold. Canadians say the same thing. So what will the result of that be other than misery for average Americans and a great buying opportunity for very, very morbidly rich people? The outcome may well be that Putin will say, hey, now's the perfect time to really go all out on Ukraine, even use nuclear weapons. That President Xi of China will say, hey, this is the perfect time to take Taiwan. I mean, after all, this is what Tojo thought. This is what Hitler thought. Economic crisis, opportunity. And of course, it's what the billionaires in America thought back in the 1930s. I mean, they weren't billionaires then, they were multimillionaires, but you get my point. And I'm just like, you know, we have never defaulted on our debt, and the Treasury is warning us about. Did you know that John Boehner, the reason why Paul Ryan became Speaker of the House, John Boehner chose his successor, basically, was because Kevin McCarthy in 2011, when they tried to do this same thing to Barack Obama, when the House Republicans tried to do the exact same thing, crash the economy on the debt crisis, Boehner worked out a compromise. Kevin McCarthy was unwilling to go along with that compromise, and that's why Boehner said screw you to Kevin McCarthy, who wanted to be the next speaker, and chose Paul Ryan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I mean, these guys are willing to offer excuses for Trump trying to overthrow the U.S. government. There's no low below which they won't go.
This
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Common Sense for the 21st Century by Roger Hallam. The subtitle, Only Nonviolent Rebellion Can Now Stop Climate Breakdown and Social Collapse. This is from the foreword. I was there for the past 20 years. Climate activism. It didn't work. We protested in our hundreds of millions. It didn't work. We raised billions to reach people and politicians. It didn't work. We signed countless online petitions. They didn't work. We looked to the United Nations to resolve the crisis. It didn't work. We trusted progressive politicians and their reforms. That didn't work. Al Gore had a big concert and a PR campaign. It didn't work. Countless NGOs, non-governmental organizations, did their best, and it didn't work. I worked with green NGO campaigns, champagne environmentalists, and lying politicians. I was wasting my time. I had a clue back in 2007 that there might be a fundamental flaw with the reformist approach. the problem with the political influence of the industrial billionaires like the Koch brothers and other fossil fuel bosses. It was another warm night in Los Angeles. I was invited to an exclusive event. A Tesla Roadster prototype was going to be shown to press and guests. We took turns riding around the block. I watched in amazement as the Tesla was at the end of the street in the blink of an eye, with barely a sound. I felt like a caveman seeing a television. Incredible. While I was working on a campaign in 2007, I had an idea for how to save the world with a massive music event and a huge fundraising effort led by celebrities to fund the biggest PR campaign to save the environment. It would be a huge global event, just like Live Aid. I sought out a prominent journalist at the Tesla event to tell about my scheme and bask in the glory of his praise. The journalist was Vijay Vithswaram from The Economist, now a life member of this Council on Foreign Relations. After listening carefully to my concept, he smiled and laughed. I was stunned. Laughter? How could I be so wrong? Vijay wasn't being cruel or unkind. He thought I was naive. He said, "The fossil fuel industry has enough money to outspend any public relations campaign you might try by 100 times. He carried on talking, but I had stopped listening. I had my answer. He was right. Crestfallen, I sheepishly nodded and walked away. Over the next 12 years, I watched as fossil fuel companies used their vast financial capital to buy political parties, trick NGOs into fruitless schemes like the U.S. Cap and Trade Initiative, sow doubt about climate science in the public discourse, and slow policy reform to a snail's pace. Their strategy worked. As skepticism continued to spread, climate change mitigation dropped down voters' priorities. With Trump and Putin in power, it was over. I quit climate campaigning. Then I heard about Extinction Rebellion closing 5 bridges in London. Then they closed central London in April 2019. This was something different. I met Roger Hallam and he explained his ideas for a radical plan to create real change. This included, first, tell the truth. Climate skepticism was pushed by the mainstream media, which spread doubt on climate science like a plague, leaving inaction in its wake. The scale of the crisis is being played down, and we must get the truth out. Second, nonviolent civil disobedience. We need to get arrested, tens of thousands of us, more. No more protests, no more petitions. Instead, nonviolent civil disobedience, lots of it, and on a large scale. Close down cities until the politicians take action, or until the people do. Third, universalism. In other words, the ecological and climate crisis should not be owned by any political ideology, culture, age, or gender. As Roger Hallam says, we all have a stake in the future. We should all be allowed to engage in action. I was convinced. We need a new approach to save ourselves and the planet. We need to spark a worldwide rebellion. We need some common sense for the 20th century. That foreword was written by, quote, anonymous climate activist. So this now is the introduction to the book. It is time to grow up and see the world as it is. There are some things which are undeniably real. There are some things we cannot change, and one of those is the law of physics. Ice melts when the temperature increases. Crops die in a drought. Trees burn in forest fires. Because these things are real, we can also be certain about what the future holds. We are now heading into a period of extreme ecological collapse. Whether this leads to the extinction of the human species largely depends on whether revolutionary changes happen within our societies within the next decade. This is not a matter of ideology, but of simple math and physics. The United Nations has estimated that we need to reduce carbon emissions by half within a decade to have a 50% chance of avoiding a global catastrophe. Of course, this is likely to be an underestimate, as recent science shows permafrost melting 90 years earlier than forecasted and Himalayan glaciers melting twice as fast as expected. The book, Common Sense for the 21st Century, by Roger Hallam, the co-founder of the Extinction Rebellion. The subtitle, Only Nonviolent Rebellion Can Now Stop. share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. Our podcast, The Hartmann Report, is absolutely free and available wherever fine podcasts are available. And the entire 3-hour podcast is available over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. And Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey, not too much, Tom. I just want to bring this up because you are about the only person that has brought this up before, the only journalist. And frankly, you were just talking about World War III, and it kind of connects there. But these Republicans, it's getting to where I am having a hard time being civil when I talk about them. Over the weekend, Ali Reza Akbari, who was the Deputy Defense Secretary of Iran under the Khatami regime, which was a reformist regime in Iran.
Right.
Okay? He was accused and arrested in 2019 when Donald Trump was president, and he was executed over the weekend.
Right.
Now,
and he was accused of essentially being a reformist, wasn't he?
No, he was accused of being a spy for the British.
Right, which was code for being a reformist.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, actually, you're getting ahead of me because I wanted to talk about that. It would seem that, all right, well, Kayhan, which is the regime newspaper in Iran, is saying that they are going to release the names. They should release the names of all the Western spies of Israel, Britain, but they left out the United States, okay? They should release all those names, and all those people should face justice. And frankly, if you look at what Russia is doing, I want to connect this to Russia because what they're doing, they blew up an apartment block in Dnipro, used an old Soviet-era KH-22, which is essentially an anti-carrier group dumb missile. Right, fired from an airplane. Now, what they're trying to do is parity. They're trying to say, well, okay, we're just going to incrementally increase as the West incrementally increases their support to Ukraine. Right. The problem is, what I've noticed is China and Russia, what they're doing is when a regime, they like in our case, a Republican regime, they would gauge that as friendly to the Kremlin. And they would probably not do much. At a certain point, they're going to see a disparity. They're going to say this democratic regime of Joe Biden is hostile to us, and then they are going to increase their attacks on us.
The they that you are using being Iran or Russia?
All right, Russia. Okay. What Russia is doing right now is, in China too, is they're attempting what they perceive as parity, right? The problem is, all right, like for instance, Germany.
Dave, we got to wrap this up. We can't go into a history lesson here. So I think your point is well made. I appreciate it. Thank you. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, what's on your mind today?
Hey, happy Martin Luther King Day to everybody.
Thank you. Back at you.
And Tom, I know you're old enough to remember when General Motors was the #1 employer in this country. Remember that?
I remember it well. I grew up in Michigan.
Okay. Oh, that's you the choir.
Yeah. Okay. My dad worked indirectly for them. His tool and die shop, their major customer was Fisher Body, which was owned by General Motors.
Oh, Fisher Body, straight up General Motors. Yeah. Well, guess who the #1 employer is today? It's Walmart. Boy, look at how wages have fallen. Okay. Now listen, I want to go back to my boy LBJ, President Johnson. He once said that if you can convince the lowest white man that he is better than the highest black man, then he will allow you to pick his pocket. My previous comment, there's an example of it. You know, Tom, racism is blinding. Racism is blinding, and it dismisses meritocracy. So now what we're all about here today is we're trying to control the narrative. We're trying to control the narrative with some euphemistic messaging and projections. So now we can promote these ideas, organized thought, if you will. Okay? And so what's happening now is people are getting false information. They're not getting good information, and they're thinking that if they go to school, get public education, will do something to help us out. But there's a war on public education. You can go listen to Rand Paul in 1988, some of the rationale he's employing. there's been a war on public education, Tom, going back to 1453 when they came in with that doctrine of Christian discovery, and then they came in with the racialized law in the 1660s in Virginia, and then they shut down schools after the Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. This has been an on and on thing. And if you want to talk about the MAGA maggots, most of their constituency came from the Democratic Party in 1965 when President Johnson started giving protections to all Americans when he tried to expand democracy. So this is a war that's been with us for a long time. Yep. And the only way out, I'm thinking of the Allman Brothers band, One Way Out. The only way out is we're going to have to figure out a way to enlighten people and educate people. And even though Florida might be trying to shut down enlightening people with public education, let me tell you something. You give a kid a smartphone, of course there's a lot of crazy stuff too, a lot of propaganda. You give a kid a smartphone, he pretty much can find out whatever he wants. So anyway, I want to thank you again, Tom, for this platform, and thank you for respecting Martin Luther King Day. And have a good day, Tom.
Thank you, Morris. Nice to hear from you. Let's see here. Jackie in Port Orchard, Washington. Hey, Jackie, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just learned something I thought was interesting. Most images of MLK that we see are in black and white, even though color was introduced in the 1890s.
But it was much more expensive
And
in
I
the
just
60s.
wonder if that sort of... What's that?
It was much more expensive. You could buy color film. You could buy black and white film quite cheaply in the 60s. Color film was quite expensive. Kodachrome and Ektachrome were the two major brands, and you know, they competed, but they were premium products.
Well, when I'm 58, so when I was like 4, I've got photos of me when I was in color. I just wonder if that sort of helps keep time and distance between us and the reality of what happened not that long ago.
Oh, interesting question. Also, I think a lot of black and white shots were, a lot of photos were shot in black and white by the news media back in the 60s because they were designed to be printed in newspapers. But, you know, your point is well taken.
You might be right.
One of the things, you know, it's a fascinating thing in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. It's kind of a subset of psychology. One of the ways that you help people deal with traumatic memories is by stripping the color out of their memory. You can literally do this. You think of a time that you know, you were. It's easy with minor irritations. You think of a time that, you know, somebody flipped you off in traffic or cut you off in traffic, or, you know, you were treated poorly by a clerk in a store or something, and you bring up that memory. And typically, if it still has an emotional charge, it's a full color memory. And so then in your mind's eye, in your imagination, you see this kind of television screen out in front of you with that memory on it. You just turn it black and white. Just strip all the color out of it. And sometimes you can really make it silly, you know, play it backwards or put donkey ears on people or whatever. And it completely changes the emotional meaning. So I think you're onto something that's actually much bigger than just this little discussion here, Jackie, that we tend to think of things before, you know, like when we think of, you know, what was the Civil War like, or when we think of what was the founding era like, we tend to think of those things in black and white also. We tend to think of history before we were born in black and white because it's like a different time. It's not as real as right now, which we're all experiencing in full color. And so I think you know, it's not so much like it's some kind of grand conspiracy or even necessarily a function of technology and price, but just, you know, the practicality of time and all those kind of things. But I think you're absolutely right that you know, when we're looking at history in black and white, we think of it at World War II. You know, look at all the old World War II movies and things from the 40s. You know, most of them are in black and white, and it just doesn't have the emotional punch that color does because it's not what's called fully modal. It doesn't fully exploit all the dimensions of vision. Have I wandered off into territory here, Jackie, or is this making sense to you?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think you validated my point, and I think I think we should all, people who post pictures should think twice and maybe just post a color picture. It makes it more.
Have you ever seen a movie that was colorized?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so have I, and suddenly it seems to me, and I don't remember the last time. I mean, there was a thing back in the 80s or 90s, you know, colorizing movies, and I don't remember which one it was. I think it might have been Sound of Music or something, but whatever it was. I remember the first time I saw a colorized movie thinking, A, oh, that's interesting how they did the colors, but B, now it seems more real. You know, it just doesn't seem like I'm watching some ancient history or something. So Yeah. Jackie, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. And you know, I think there's something to all this. Bill in Los Angeles. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Yes, happy MLK Day. I think we live in, I think we live in ridiculous times. I've noticed, you know, forever that at the MLK Day parades here in Los Angeles, we see grotesque, you know, manifestations of militarism, both the military proper and of the militarized police. It's a ridiculous thing that the institution responsible for racism, the institutionalized racism of black folks, the police, are on full display. The ridiculousness of the fact that we have a war chief in the Biden administration, a historic segregationist telling people that they're not black if they don't vote for Biden.
Who's the historic segregationist who's telling people that they're not black if they vote for Biden?
If they're not black if they don't vote for Biden.
Right. Who is this person?
Biden said it himself that you're not black
he didn't.
if you don't vote for.
He was.
Okay,
well, okay. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I think you're mischaracterizing.
Shoot him in the legs. Shoot him in the legs. Biden said this, but the ridiculousness. There's also I do want to take issue with you calling the Republican recessions. You're quoting Gramsci on some of the psychological things that he says that are very interesting. But Gramsci was a Marxist. This is
I was not quoting Gramsci.
Under capitalism, you were talking about Gramsci. Gramsci was a Marxist. So if you call it a Republican recession, you're denying the features of capitalism, the bust boom cycle of capitalism. That is just like Marx predicted that every 7 to 10 years there's an economic downturn. In the fact it gets more.
Well, that's a different thing from a depression.
There's.
I mean, you know, if you
on the fact.
Yeah, I don't want to turn this into a
declining rate.
I get it, Bill, that you want to debate the benefits or horrors of capitalism, or regulated capitalism versus or Marxism or whatever. It's not. We're out of time anyway. Bill, thanks for the call. We'll be right back. Stick around. It's the place where we dare to ask, is Walmart a person? And we dare to say, no, I don't think so. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
46 minutes past the hour. Back with your calls right after this. And welcome back. Wayne in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Hey, Wayne, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom. Happy Martin Luther King Day.
Thank you.
I'd like to discuss things, what we're all really dealing with overall. And what we're actually dealing with is a war of the fossil fuel industry and renewable green era that we're trying to move into. And the Republican agenda basically has called it out that they're going to do everything to stifle anything that's going to be progressive for green renewable initiatives. So like as in the war in Ukraine, Russia's destroying all the fossil fuel infrastructure there. So I'd like to know what the United States is doing to help move the Ukraine into a renewable energy era. Are we incentivizing solar? Are we incentivizing other renewable sources?
I reported on this about maybe a month or two ago. Sean might remember more clearly. But there was an international conference, and there were government officials, and then there was a bunch of people from industry. So, you know, it was kind of a neoliberal crowd, which didn't, totally excite me. But the conference was about the reconstruction of Ukraine. And there were a number of people at this conference, obviously representing, the solar industry, the wind industry, things like that, who were arguing that Ukraine could become, for the West, the great new test. China's actually doing this, and there are some of the smaller cities in in China, they're I mean, literally building entire cities that are based on renewable energy. But no Western country has ever done this. And Ukraine could be that test case where if we went in, I mean, given the extraordinary depth of the massive destruction of infrastructure that the Russians have been doing and continue to do, that rebuilding Ukraine could be just a beautiful test project for how to create a Western economy that functions without fossil fuels, or very minimally with fossil fuels.
Well, as the Republican Party is in the pocket of big oil and gas, it's basically a decision in this country that we have to make to remove ourselves off of fossil fuels, because that's going to be the only way that we get a more sane Republican Party in this country.
Yeah. And
the ideology around doing that, it seems totally off the radar to the American public.
Yeah, there is no doubt about it that the fossil fuel industry is you know,
running the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And the auto industry, both of them.
Well, I don't know if they're running the auto industry, but because auto industry is figuring out.
I don't know why you wouldn't think that. If they weren't, we'd have higher fuel efficiency standards in this country. There's no reason why cars in 2023 are on the average being produced, you know, in the mid-20 miles per gallon range.
Well, Honda made a car that got 70 miles to the gallon. I owned one for 2 years, the Honda Insight, and it just didn't sell. People didn't want it.
Well, there's something wrong with the American psychology and the world. If we can't see a dire need and to move off of fossil fuels,
I'm with you, Wayne.
It's unbelievable.
I'm with you. Wayne, thanks for the call. And thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. It's 10 minutes before. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Welcome back. 9 minutes before the hour. Kenyatta in Los Angeles. Hey, Kenyatta, how you doing today?
Happy New Year and Hujambo, brother.
Thank you. Back at you.
I wanted to speak a little bit on Martin Luther King holiday about Dr. King. Of course, we are bombarded every year with the perfunctory and trite reminiscences of his dream, and the perpetual questions of has the dream been realized, and blah 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 blah. But I'd like to, and I've mentioned this to you before, that my philosophy is that in order to dream, you have to be asleep. But Martin Luther King was not a dreamer. Martin Luther King was a visionary.
Agreed.
He had a vision when he talked about a nation where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. That was the vision that he had. It wasn't a dream. That vision has not been realized. And he was not, he was very much a radical as well. Mm-hmm. If Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, both of them were visionaries, if they were both alive today, doing what they were doing then, they would both meet the same end. My belief is that they would both be assassinated. And let me tell you something. If Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, since their assassinations, you will know that even with all of these first black this, first black that, first black senator, first black president, first black Supreme Court justice, blah, blah, blah. None of those people, in terms of their activism, has put the black condition at the forefront. And the purpose of those assassinations is to make sure that nobody does. And that's just my opinion. One of the things that you said was very interesting at the beginning of the show was the weaponization of Dr. King's, the selective picking of his words and how they've been weaponized by certain people. And there was a beautiful example of what you said, not beautiful, but I'm being facetious, a good example of what you were saying recently. The Los Angeles Police Department has started up again with this assassination squads, and they're killing people left and right. and the police chief in Los Angeles, Michael Moore, is up to have his contract renewed and be approved by the city council. There's a lot of pushback against him because of the way that the LAPD has been conducting itself. And one of the things that he said a few days ago was he used that very line that, he admired Dr. King because of this content of not color of skin, but content of character business. And it is so insulting to me as this black man anyway, because that dream hasn't been realized. That reality does not exist. It doesn't. When Dr. King said that the United States reneged on a check, it has basically given the black man a check and it's bounced and it hasn't honored that check. I'm paraphrasing. That is the same thing. So the whole point that I wanted to make is that he wasn't a dreamer. He was a visionary. He was a radical. And if he conducted the same activism today, the way that he did then, he would not only meet the same end, he would probably face the same type treatment. And Michael Moore, the chief of police, who ironically used his words and weaponized them, would probably arrest him and beat him to death. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think everyone needs to sober up with this whole business. And that's it.
Very well said, Kenyatta. I can't disagree with anything you said. And yeah, he was a visionary, and yes, today he would be even more. Well, not even more, but he would be. They call. Well, Dan Rather said this morning. They would call him woke and trash him, and I think you're right. They would be trying to kill him. Kenyatta, great to hear from you. Thank you, and thanks for the New Year wishes. I hope it's a great year for you and your family too. Thank you. Pearson in Lamarck, Texas. Hey, Pearson, what's on your mind?
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're listening to your program. Earlier, black lady said something that brought a flashback to my earlier childhood, like when I was in first or second grade. My cousins and I, when we were growing up, we usually make fun of our grandparents' generation, who now we refer to as the greatest generation, I believe.
Yeah.
We would look at the way they dressed, those long ankle-length dresses and the dark hose with the ugly line going down the middle and the clunky-looking shoes, not to mention the oral scratchy music that they listened to, not stereo like what we had. And even though we had black and white TV, we never had the color TV when it came in. One of our cousins did. So we felt somewhat smug, I guess. But it's funny how history unfolds in our minds, because you're right. We look at things, especially pre-color in black and white, and we tend to assign them a lesser value. And that's why I think Downton Abbey does a great service in bringing to life and in full color through the actors and the scripts that people in the 1920s had the same problems and issues that we had, and they were seeing advances in their time, just like we're seeing advances in our time.
Yeah.
No real difference. And finally, I will also say that a lot of times when we see the footage, news footage, and TV interviews from MLK's day and Martin Luther and Malcolm X's day, all in black and white. For people that are young right now, they will tend to see that in a similar fashion, unless we make them conscious of the fact that, hey, don't be so smug. Look what I did.
Yeah. Well, that was
them.
Yeah. We need to reinforce the reality of it. Pearson, thank you. Yeah, I believe it was Jackie. I think her point was brilliant. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
For our book club today, we're reading from David Blight's book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. This is from the introduction. In his speech at the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., September 24, 2016, President Barack Obama delivered what he termed a, quote, clear-eyed view of a tragic and triumphant history of black Americans in the United States. He spoke of a history that is central to the larger American story, one that is both victory and extreme. He likened the African American experience to the infinite depths of Shakespeare and Scripture. The, quote, embrace truth as best we can know it, said the president, is, quote, where real patriotism lies. Naming some of the major pivots of the country's past, Obama wrapped up his central theme in a remarkable sentence about the Civil War era. Quote, buttoned up our Union blues, joined the fight for our freedom. We've railed against it decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze, end quote. How Americans react to Douglass's gaze, indeed how we gaze back at his visage, and more important, how we read him, appropriate him, or engage his legacies, informs how we use our past to determine who we are. Douglass's life and writing emerged from nearly the full scope of the 19th century, representative of the best and the worst in the American spirit. Douglass constantly probed the ironies of America's contradiction for slavery and race. Few Americans use Shakespeare and the Bible to comprehend his story and that of his people as much as Douglass. And there may be no better example of an American radical patriot than the slave who became a lyrical prophet of freedom, natural rights, and human equality. Obama channeled Douglass in his dedication speech, knowingly or not. So do many people today. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a slave, in Talbot County, Maryland, in February 1818, the future Frederick Douglass was the son of Harriet Bailey, one of 5 daughters of Betsy Bailey, and with some likelihood his mother's white owner. He saw his mother for the last time in 1825, though he hardly knew her. She died the following year. Douglass lived 20 years as a slave and nearly 9 years as a fugitive slave subject to recapture. From the 1840s to his death in 1895, he attained international fame as an abolitionist, editor, orator of almost unparalleled signature, and the author of 3 autobiographies that are classics of the genre. As a public man, he began his abolitionist career 2 decades before America would divide and fight a civil war over slavery that he openly welcomed. Douglass was born in a backwater of the slave society of the South, just as steamboats appeared in bays and on American rivers, and before the telegraph, the railroad, and the rotary press changed human mobility and consciousness. He died after the emergence of electric lights, the telephone, and the invention of the phonograph. The renewed orator and traveler loved and used most of these elements of modernity and technology. Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, explained in this book, and especially by the intrepid research of 3 other scholars I write upon. Although it can never really be measured, he may also have been, along with Mark Twain, the most widely traveled American public figure of his century. The 1890s, in sheer miles of speeches, he had few rivals as a lecturer in the golden age of oratory. It is likely that more Americans heard Frederick Douglass speak than any other public figure of his time. Indeed, to see or hear Douglas became a kind of wonder of the American world. He struggled as well with the pleasures and perils of fame as much as anyone else in his century, with the possible exceptions of General Ulysses S. Grant or P.T. Barnum. Douglas's dilemma with fame was decades, not merely of moments, and fraught with racism. The orator and writer lived to see and interpret black emancipation, to work actively for women's rights long before they were achieved, to realize the civil rights triumphs and tragedies of Reconstruction, and to witness and contribute to America's economic and international expansion in the Gilded Age. He lived to the lynching and Jim Crow laws when America collapsed to retreat from the real victories and revolutions in race relations that he had helped to win. He played a pivotal role in America's second founding out of the apocalypse of the Civil War, and he very much wished to see himself as a founder and defender of the Second American Republic. In one lifetime of anti-slavery, literary, and political activism, Douglas was many things, and this set of apparent paradoxes makes his story so attractive to biographers, as well as to so many constituencies today. He was a radical thinker and a proponent of classic century political liberalism. At different times, he hated and loved his country. He was a ferocious critic of the United States and all its hypocrisies, but also, after emancipation, became a government bureaucrat, a diplomat, and a voice for territorial expansion. He strongly believed in science and demanded an activist interventionist government at all levels to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and to protect black citizens against terror and discrimination. Douglas was a serious constitutional thinker, and few Americans have ever analyzed race with more poignancy and nuance than this mostly self-taught genius with words. He was a radical editor, writer, and activist. The book Douglas by David Blight.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. As I mentioned in the opening of the program an hour ago, the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is much more extensive than the single sentence that is constantly repeated by people like Tom Cotton, white Republicans, about judging people based on their character rather than the color of their skin. And he, as Kenyatta pointed out in the last hour, he really was, or would be considered certainly by Republicans today, to be a radical. And he was advocating some very, very specific policies. Let's look at some of those. Algernon Austin is with us. He's the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Previously the director at EPI's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, excuse me. Now, CEPR.net is the website, and Algernon Twitter handle is Algernon_Austin, ALGERNON_AUSTIN, and of course, CEPRDC also on Twitter. Algernon, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us. Tell us, and I love this piece that you guys wrote at CEPR.net, Full Employment for All. Tell us about this program that Dr. King was advocating.
Well, this year is the 60th anniversary year of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And I think it's really important that people call it the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom so that we remember, yes, as you were saying, so that we don't reduce it to the dream and a couple of other brief quotations, that the march was a jobs march, a march for economic justice and civil rights, both. Both were quite important to the activists. So on this 60th anniversary year, we really want to lift up the jobs part. So we have this Full Employment for All campaign. The Center for Economic and Policy Research and 9 other organizations are kicking off on Martin Luther King Day. And it's important to remember, yes, he was a radical. He was fighting very hard for economic justice. His last year, he was focused on the Poor People's Campaign. And both Dr. King and Coretta Scott King believed that the country needed a large government program to make sure that everyone who wants to work would be able to work, and that this was an important part of their anti-poverty strategy. And it's important to remember that in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, one of the demands was for a massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. That's the quote of the demand. So economic justice was a fundamental concern and seen as part and parcel of what was necessary for civil rights and for Black advancement.
Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but my recollection, or it seems to me that Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to introduce the idea, or actually to implement the idea, that the federal government could be the employer of last resort during a time of economic crisis. And of course, Dr. King was saying the federal government could become, or even state governments could become the employer of last resort, even when we're not in a time of economic crisis generally nationwide, because there are these pockets of economic crisis that simply never go away. You talk about them in your piece at CEPR.net here today. In New Mexico and Arizona, Latino people suffering from joblessness. In Mississippi and Louisiana, it's mostly Black people impoverished because of lack of work. In Indiana and Michigan, Asian Americans who are without work. In South Dakota and Alaska, Native Americans want to work but are unable to find employment. Can you talk about that, the history of government as the employer of last resort?
Yes, there is a long history, and one of our partners, the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, has part of that history. They have a 40-year review of all the different programs that we've done, and they've been very successful. Yes, we can go back to the WPA programs, which were very effective and responding to the Great Depression. But there have been others. Unfortunately, many of the others were small scale and demonstration projects. But the review of the literature shows that these programs are very effective at putting people back to work and increasing their income, reducing poverty, reducing crime, has benefits to individuals, to families, to communities. So we really need to have a large federal program that's targeted to these pockets of high joblessness. So for now, people might say, well, right now the economy is too hot and we're at full employment. And yes, overall, looking at the national statistics, it looks very good. But while the national unemployment rate last year averaged about 3.6%, in Gary, Indiana, it was about 8%, so more than twice. In Flint, Michigan, it was about 11%, in the double digits. If you look at Washington, D.C., among Black people in D.C., it's, again, about 11% in the end of last year. So the national statistics look very good, but there are many communities that are still dealing with high unemployment, still dealing with double-digit employment. And the federal government, we're a very rich country, has the capacity to target these communities with subsidized employment and really help reduce joblessness, reduce poverty, reduce crime, spur economic development in these communities that have been left behind. So this is what Martin Luther King Jr. was focused on, and this is what he has explicitly called for if you look at his writings around jobs and labor. So we really, if we want to commemorate Martin Luther King, we have to pay attention to his economic justice concerns.
We're talking with Algernon Austin. He's the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR.net. You have you're calling for this program of, I'm calling it government as employer of last resort. I'm sure you've got a different name for it. And you've got all these organizational endorsements, obviously CEPR, Center for Law and Social Policy, Community Change Action, DC Fiscal Policy Institute, Economic Policy Institute, Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, the Heartland Alliance, Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, Labor and Working Class History Association, the Ohio River Valley Institute, and a whole bunch of individuals signed on with this. Can you tell us what the specifics are of the program that you're calling for?
Well, we are calling for a targeted federal subsidized employment program. So in every state in the nation, I gave some examples before, there are communities that are facing high levels of joblessness today. And it's very important if we want these communities to share in prosperity, that we enable both the private enable the public sector to create jobs. There are lots of work that the public sector can do and does best, frankly. And that should be subsidized. There are nonprofit organizations that have work and activities that they want to do, and then there are also for-profit organizations that could benefit. I've given the example of food deserts. Now we can talk about DC again. In the southeast DC, it's a very large area, and there's only grocery stores. Now it's hard to get grocery stores into that community, but if the labor costs were somewhat by the federal government, that changes the calculus. So that could really help bring grocery stores to food deserts. And again, we see this joblessness in every state in this country. There are pockets of high levels of joblessness that need assistance, that need subsidized employment, and it can be the public sector, it can be the nonprofit, it can be for-profit, to allow people who want to work, to make an income. So that's the program. It's let's use our resources to target these communities that have been left behind.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Algernon Austin, the Director of Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. You can read all about it at CEPR.net, Algernon_Austin or CEPRDC on Twitter. Algernon, thanks so much for dropping by.
Thank you very much.
Great meeting you. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
15 minutes past the hour. It's always been about control. And is DiSantis running for president on the bodies of women? We'll talk about that in just a second. Dave in Armstrong Creek, Wisconsin. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Happy Martin Luther King Day.
Thank you. Back at you.
So I'm 70 years old, so I remember a lot of that time. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of the things, I was paying a lot of attention to the Vietnam War. I was at that age where getting to the point of being drafted. And I remember when he was very popular after that I Had a Dream speech and a lot of the other stuff that was going on. But when he started talking against that war, he lost a lot of support with the political establishment and a lot of the country, too. So, of course, that, he got assassinated, and they finally, made a federal holiday for him. But there was a time there when he wasn't that popular in some areas. So
oh, yeah.
I just thought I'd bring that up.
No, and King's opposition to the war is almost never mentioned any longer. I mean, and it was front and center for him.
Oh, yeah, it was a big thing, big deal to me, I tell you what.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent point, Dave. Excellent point. Thank you very much for calling and making it. I appreciate it. Pat in San Diego. Hey, Pat, what's up?
Hi, Tom. How's your back, first of all?
I'm okay. Knock wood.
Hope you're having a good new year.
Thank you.
Yes, what Dave said is kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit. Unfortunately, our media and our government do minimize the role of Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke about lots more than this. I've got a dream. In fact, the speech he gave about Vietnam is just monumental.
Yes.
And it's online, and I heard it all last night, and there's the transcript of it. It's called Beyond Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And it deals not just with the war and how it affects the poor, that it is mainly fought by the poor, who are then trampled upon once they get back, and they do not get proper treatment. But he also spoke about hate, that we cannot afford to worship. He says afford to worship the god of hate or retaliation, which we are living through right now. And on national values, he was saying we have to turn this society away from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. These are messages that the government didn't want us to hear. And so they have buried that speech. Also, they have buried the true assassin of Martin Luther King. And this is just criminal, because he was not assassinated by James Earl Ray, as they continue to say. If you search right now and you say who assassinated Martin Luther King, it'll say James Earl Ray. That is a bald-faced lie. And, you know, I had to go into the Wayback Machine, and I wonder who keeps that. They probably have also started to pervert that.
So who do you think assassinated him?
The U.S. government.
Oh.
I had to go all the way back. It's not what I think. It's what was proven in court by the King family. And they sued the FBI, and you have to go into the way back.
I think their argument was that the federal government was complicit because they were tracking Ray. Wasn't it?
No, they murdered. You have to go into the Wayback Machine all the way to 2012 to find the article, to find the evidence, because bury it now. You cannot find it if you search now.
Okay. Pat, thank you. Thanks for the call. 20 minutes past the hour. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So everybody knows that George Santos is from a district that Joe Biden won by 16 points, New York's 3rd district, although there was a kind of a gerrymandering, or excuse me, a reapportionment thing that happened there. But it's generally a Democratic district, and if Santos falls, there's probably going to be a Democratic replacement. But that's just the beginning of the story. David Vallejo in California's 22nd district, for example, represents a district that Biden carried by 16 points. Young Kim in California's 40th, Biden carried by 15 points. Mike Garcia in California's 27th, Biden carried by 18 points. Biden carried by 11 points, Oregon's 5th, Lori Chavez DeRemer. Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania's 1st, Biden carried it by 14 points. I've got a whole video that lists all of these. There's 18 of them that should be easy pickups for the Democrats in 2020. It's over at Tom.com. Check it out. 22 minutes past the hour. So it's I've been posting, you know, when the whole Elon Musk Twitter meltdown started happening, I thought, well, you know, time to explore other social media sites as well. I'm still on Twitter, and in fact, I think that if Musk can succeed in turning Twitter into a pay-for-play operation, it might actually be a good thing for social media. But that's a whole separate argument and a conversation we can have another time. But anyhow, when this all happened, I signed up for Tribal, I signed up for Post, and I signed up for Mastodon, and I post on all of those sites every morning my daily take. I posted all of them this morning. And, you know, there's a bunch of people that I follow on a bunch of those websites, and one of them over on Mastodon is Muriel View, I believe is how it would be pronounced, V-I-E-U-X. And you can find her on Mastodon. And she wrote this piece, and it's got a copyright notice on it, so I very much want to acknowledge this, that she is, I think, just making an absolutely brilliant point. She said it's not birth control, it's just control. That's her headline. And she starts out by talking about, you know, first you banned abortions after 6 weeks, and then you threatened my doctors if they performed one, and then you threatened my friends if they helped. She's talking, of course, about the Texas law, the bounty law, you know, the vigilante law, and now this is spreading to other states, by the way. She says, then you offered money to snitchers, as I just mentioned. Then you restricted my rights to get it legally elsewhere. And this, of course, you know, states all around the country, you know, banning abortion. She said, then you banned the morning after pill. Isn't that before 6 weeks? And there have, you know, been attempts to ban the morning after pill in state after state. Then you banned methods to prevent implantation. And she says, then you banned aborting non-viable fetuses. Then you banned aborting ectopic pregnancies. I'm not sure that that's altogether the case. I don't think ectopic pregnancies have been banned in any state, but there certainly have been legislators, Republican legislators, pushing for it. Then you banned them for those who've been raped, yep, in some states. Then you banned them in the case of incest, yes, in some states. Then you forced children to carry to term. Of course, we had that case of that Ohio 10-year-old who had to go to Indiana to get an abortion. And now that abortion doctor who had the temerity to speak out is being investigated by the Indiana Attorney General. Investigate is the wrong word. Persecuted is the correct word. Then Muriel continues. She said, then you forced women to carry dead then you forced women to carry dead fetuses to term. Then you said I could only be helped on the brink of death. Then you denied me prenatal care. And this is where it gets really, you know, the picture really starts to expand. And I think Muriel's done a great job here. She says, then you denied me prenatal care and maternal care and child care. And then, and this, again, this is just, this now goes to the courts. Then you gave rapists parental rights. Now you're banning birth control. Now you're telling me how to dress. Well, at least in the Missouri legislature they are. And now you're monitoring my period apps and my social apps. And, you know, her summary is that it has always been about control. And I don't see how you can claim that, you know, most of this stuff that's coming out of the GOP is about anything other than control. It just very, very clearly is. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis has sent out a letter to pharmacies across the state of Florida. Now, the backstory of this is that the Food and Drug Administration last month, or actually it was early this month, allowed retail pharmacies to stock and dispense abortion pills. Milprestone, I always pronounce this wrong, but you know what I'm talking about. It's mifepristone. Up to 10 weeks of gestation. It's the most common way to end a pregnancy in the United States. And in Florida, you know, that should be legal, but Florida law makes it really difficult to get an abortion, and all of the hoops that you have to jump through. Number one, it has to be done by a physician, and therefore the pharmacist can't do it. And number two, you have to see the doctor, then wait 24 hours, and then come back and see the doctor again. And so Ron DeSantis is reminding all the pharmacies, the CVS's and the Walgreens and all these smaller independent pharmacies across the state of Florida that we will come for you, we will put you in jail, we will shut down your business, we will use the full force of the law against you if you sell those, if your pharmacists pass out those abortion pills, even though the federal government has legalized them. I'm wondering if the supremacy clause kicks in here.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
The supremacy clause says that federal law trumps state law. Although this is an FDA thing, it might be considered a regulation, not law. I'm not sure. If you know, give me a shout.
Our book for today is Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network by David Montero. This is from the introduction, Chapter 1. During Watergate, the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate Richard Nixon's alleged tampering with elections was intended to mark the close of a sordid chapter in American history Instead, that effort, culminating in Nixon's resignation, would prove to be only the beginning of a deeper political mess that America would face for decades to come. Congressional investigations would uncover for the first time that multinational corporations, through slush funds and bribes, were not only secretly funding political organizations at home, like Nixon's re-election campaign, but corrupting foreign officials abroad. This new perspective on the corporate abuse of power and its impact overseas would result in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FPCA, groundbreaking legislation that, by prohibiting commercial bribery for the first time in history, sought to change how capitalism and political affairs were conducted all around the world. Now, more than 40 years later, we are experiencing a kind of deja vu as the special counsel investigates whether the president allegedly abused his power, again by obstructing an inquiry into a possible manipulation of our country's elections. Just as was the case in Watergate, whatever special counsel Robert Mueller uncovers will likely mark the beginning, rather than the end, of a reassessment of how power actually operates in this country. And just as in Watergate, there's the possibility that Mueller's far-reaching probe may reveal how tightly political corruption and corporate corruption are linked through bribery, just under the surface of America's political life. Nixon was the recipient of secret corporate donations, which were considered illegal because they should have been disclosed. But the payments, while awful, did not compromise the presidential election itself. Mueller's Russian inquiry is directed at a potentially far more serious crime, whether Donald Trump, the head of a sprawling business empire, colluded with a foreign power to deliberately sway the American electorate, committing the very crime that the FCPA had been trying to eradicate since Watergate, the offer of a foreign bribe, a kickback. That law specifically states that a corporate bribe need not involve an actual exchange of money. An offer of anything of value, such as a promise to a foreign government official, is sufficient to violate its terms. This is precisely what Mueller is trying to ascertain, whether Trump, his company, his associates, or his family, or some combination of them, offered a promise to Russian government officials, a quid pro quo, that if they helped Trump by manipulating the elections, Trump, if victorious, would ease U.S. sanctions against Russia. Doing so would allow greater U.S. investment of Russia and would benefit Russian officials and oligarchs, the Trump business organization, the corporate interests of the Trump family, and former members of his senior staff, including Paul Manafort, his one-time campaign chairman, and Michael Flynn, his disgraced national security advisor. If the Trump organization or anyone connected with it did make such a promise, and depending on how that promise was conveyed to Russian officials, the Justice Department would have strong grounds for pursuing an FCPA charge, among others. An FCPA violation is within Mueller's mandate to investigate, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from this investigation. As has been widely observed, Mueller has hired 2 former federal law enforcement officials with extensive experience in investigating fraud, money laundering, and overseas bribery. Andrew Weissman, who ran the Justice Department's fraud section, which enforces the FCPA, and Greg Andres, who helped oversee FCPA policy in the criminal division. The drama playing out in Washington starkly highlights the fact that foreign corporate bribery can be a deeply misleading term. We have come to regard it, when we think of it at all, as something that unscrupulous companies do in distant countries, so that any impact it has must be contained overseas. If a corporation pays kickbacks to a greedy government official abroad, why should we be concerned? But in a highly interconnected world, bound together by a global market, a global financial system, and the constant migration of peoples, goods, capital, corruption rarely stays out there. Bribes eventually harm Americans, American society, American values, and American interests, both domestically and around the world, in ways that are difficult to gauge. Why do firms resort to bribery? The obvious reason is to gain an advantage over their competitors. But illicit payments also buy the illusion of growth in the short term, of increased market share and inflated firm value. It does not take into account the harm that this practice causes to companies themselves, sinking employee morale, diminished profit margins, and the possibility of hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and penalties, not to mention a reputation that will be associated with corruption and deceit. They also effectively steal the public's money because the majority of bribery cases involve capital-intensive development and infrastructure projects such as roads, dams, defense systems, oil extraction, or mining that are publicly funded. To recoup the bribes involved in winning such contracts, companies conspire with foreign officials to inflate the costs, sometimes by 10 or even hundreds of millions of dollars. While the companies and the officials win out, taxpayers are left shouldering the burden. Corporate bribes involve a remarkable amount of money. The World Bank has estimated $1 trillion a year, although this may represent the high end. Others have placed the market at 10% of the $4 trillion spent annually on global public procurement. The book Kickback by David Montero.
Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nation, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. There was a time in America where a single wage earner could support a middle-class lifestyle, and that meant being able to buy a 3-bedroom house, have a couple of cars if necessary, take an annual vacation, occasionally maybe even go overseas, send your kids to college, having roof repairs or major problems with your home didn't throw you into bankruptcy, or getting sick didn't do that. That was America throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and even the early 90s. But then Reaganism bit hard. It's really particularly been biting us in the last couple of decades. And now, in order to have that middle-class lifestyle, you need to have 2 workers, and you need to have an income of typically well over $100,000 a year in order to have that kind of security. I've got a whole rant about this with a lot more details over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour. And picking up your calls here, Bill in Clifton, New Jersey. Hey, Bill, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I was about color earlier, and as I may have mentioned, I used to work as a commercial photographer. Then I worked in fine art photography exhibits.
Oh, I'll bet you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, color, by the way, are you familiar with Pantone?
Yes.
You worked in advertising? Yeah, it's like a color swatch guide that universally is used in printing.
Yep.
And this year's color of the year is called Viva Magenta. If you look at that color on their Pantone page, it sort of draws you in. The difference between color and black and white is that black and white, everything has to be perfect because it's a matter of contrast and exposure, whereas in color, you can hide a multitude of sins in terms of contrast. And details are taken over by color, and everybody is biased in terms of a color or another. Whatever draws you in, like if you look at something as royal blue, it's known, universally that green calms people, and that's why they would have green rooms and they would paint hospital corridors. And I would work with clients, and these are art galleries and big deal people, and their color eye was terrible. If you're in the industry and you're really good, you have a good color eye, which means you can see 5% difference in tonal colors. But it was all based on their preference. And so the way they saw it, and I had a boss when I worked in what was considered a pretty technical situation, which was called color division. It was I had a boss who said he was colorblind. I said, how do you make things perfect? These are color separations. He said, I just make everything a little bit perfect. And so it's everybody has their own biases, the way they see colors, and they're drawn in. And you can talk people into. I talk clients into different colors. I mean, just the way it affects you emotionally. And it's a hard thing to control or think about. And everybody sees different frequency of light, and then there's how it affects you. In the beginning of photography, they were superstitious, but it stole your soul, and that they shouldn't take pictures of people. And so, so like black and white photographers like Ansel Adams, if you look at his stuff, you can see everything from the lightest white all the way gradated to the blackest black, and whereas if it was a color shot, wouldn't really matter as much because of what the color adds to the image itself.
Right. It allows you to get away with it. That's fascinating, Bill. I generally knew that stuff, but I've never heard it so succinctly summarized, and appreciate that. Bill, thank you. Thanks for sharing the wisdom of your experience with us. Catherine in Burlington, Vermont. Hey, Catherine, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I was thinking about Mahatma Gandhi when you were talking about slavery, and today is MLK Day. I wanted to tell you what Mahatma Gandhi told his followers when he was liberating them. He said, the English are not our enemy. They are our friend. We are our own enemy. In us, we have a tendency toward pushing somebody down or pushing people down. And he said to them, look at what we do to the untouchables.
Yeah.
What is that?
Which is the lowest caste in India.
They carry the feces on their heads.
Yep.
And can I tell you something? They are happy.
Well,
that's a totally different topic.
I don't know that that's true, Catherine. I can't imagine being kept in horrible, horrible jobs my entire life because of the caste into which I was born. But I get your point, and
yeah, and we have slavery still. We have minimum wage, and nobody really questions it except for people paid to question it.
Yeah, I think the problem with calling that slavery, and I don't disagree with you that it's a horrible exploitation, is that you don't want to, it's just, associating things with holocausts. You don't want to minimize the horrors of actual chattel slavery in the United States and around the world, for that matter. I mean, it's still going on. There's some estimates that several 100 million people right now are the victims of chattel slavery.
Could you give me a couple of examples that you might know of?
You can easily track this on the internet. I mean, across the Middle East, there are countries and royal families that have been accused on multiple occasions of holding slaves. You've got entire political movements that are based in slavery in some parts of Africa, tragically. When I was in South Sudan, one of the things that we were doing was bringing back people. The Sudanese, Sudan to the north is a Muslim brown-skinned country, and South Sudan to the south is it's mostly Dinka is the tribe, and mostly they were animists. There are some Christians among them, but mostly animists, very black-skinned people. And for decades, the Muslims to the north had been raiding the south and stealing young people and taking them to the north and keeping them as slaves. And then when they get old and sick, or sick, or they're no longer working well, they would take them to the border of the south and basically just dump them. And this group that Alan Ratner took us to meet there, I mean, I was there for about a week, and I think probably 400 or 500 formerly enslaved people came through that crossing. This was about 15 miles from the border with Darfur. And so, it's still happening. It's happening all around the world. Not just it's happening in Asia. I'm sure that slavery is happening in South America. It wouldn't surprise me if it's, if there are pockets of it in North America. So, I don't think that we can minimize that or necessarily, clearly associate that with minimum wage work. But, we've got a horrible underclass in the United States.
No, I'm an artist. So I'm just saying that we have the American version.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I get it. Catherine,
$7 an hour. Come on, Tom.
Yeah, no, $7 an hour is a joke. Nobody can live on that. Catherine, thank you very much. MJ in Seattle. Hey, MJ, thanks for calling. What's up?
Hey, I'm calling today because I love your show. And I am absolutely sick of the way that the Republicans are using the word woke. And we just need to reframe it and call them out, because they're using it's the worst kind of dog whistle, because they can get away with saying it over and over and over. And you know, what, you want to be unwoke, you want to be unenlightened, unknowledgeable, you want to be ignorant, you want your children not to know what's going on, what happened historically, what people still live through today, because we won't do anything about it. I'm just fed up. Yeah. And so if we just make a little tweak to that word when it comes up, I want to be awake. I want to be awake. And it's so aggravating to deal with people who will use a small thing to denigrate, you know, huge swaths of the country. Yeah. And the in between the left and the right are people who could go either way. We've seen this happened with Donald Trump. If they hear an argument that plays into their sense of resentment about not being able to have health care, not being able to have support at their workplace through a union, they don't even, they will fight against unions because they've been told that's the thing to do, when the union would help them, have those things that they really need. Yeah. And
MJ, the conservative movement is grounded in grievance. I mean, that's pretty much all they have to offer the American people, because they don't have a forward-looking, positive governing theory or principle or anything at the core of their philosophy. And so they're doing with the word woke right now what they did with the word liberal in the 1980s. And they so successfully demonized liberal, and Rush Limbaugh led this charge, by the way. I remember it well. They so successfully demonized liberal that in 1992, when Bill Clinton became president, he refused to call himself a liberal. Generally speaking, and Democrats right across the board just, oh, I'm not a liberal, I'm a moderate Democrat. And look at where it got us. I mean, what they're trying to do is shift what's called the Overton window, the acceptable, the range, the parameters of acceptable conversation in society. And MJ, thank you for the call. I agree with you. I don't want to go back to sleep, frankly. So I think, if somebody starts ranting about woke, oh, you'd rather be asleep? Really? We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's your media support group for We the People. Back with your calls in just a moment. Back, James in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Hey, James, what's up?
Tom, hey, your opening rant, pretty scary. So I just wanted to tell you why it scared me. It brought me back to the primary debates when Bernie truthfully pointed out that Biden his whole life wanted to cut Social Security. And those videos are easy to find. They fact-checked that. And at the time...
James, what's your alternative to Joe Biden? I had a caller earlier who was trashing Biden, too. Who would you prefer? Would you like Kevin McCarthy running the country?
That's not my point at all. My point is we can't fall for theater and blame Republicans if Biden his whole life has said he wants to cut it and then cuts it.
This is not about Joe Biden, James. Joe Biden is not the one who's leading the crusade to crash America. No, he's
the guy that...
He's the president.
He's the guy that wanted to do it, so...
Yeah, oh, God, it's another tanky. James, thanks a lot. Good luck. Maverick in Edmonds, Washington. Hey, Maverick, what's on your mind today?
Well, Tom, welcome to the fold of the electric car world. It's
thank
wonderful.
You. Yeah.
Your last caller just cracked me up because there's some crackpot that I always read the letters to the editors first in my local paper, and there's a crackpot that's always trashing electric cars in there, and he's got his facts completely wrong. It's pretty easy to pick him up. real quick, yeah, your previous caller mentioned something about woke. That term was first used about 100 years ago in a blues song where the artist wanted his members of his let's call it his tribe to be woke as far as the dangers of being caught out after dark alone, in the context that like the white cops might give him a hard time. So that term's been around for a while.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I just learned that a couple of days ago off of one of my other internet sources who I randomly fact-checked and have never found it to be wrong. That's Bo with the fifth column. But real quick, I got this one's going to put a smile on your face. We'll talk about electric cars. I had a procedure last week where I had to be put out for an hour or so. And when I woke up, they asked me how I was feeling. And the first thing I said in the recovery room was, "Is Trump in jail yet?"
Did that get applause from the?
I think they were more stunned than anything else, and everyone was wearing a mask. I couldn't tell real well, but I feel like it was more well received than not well received.
Yeah. Well, they didn't put you back to sleep.
Good point. Okay, excellent. Anyway, I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
Yeah.
So with electric cars, we are, the last 100 years has been the age of the internal combustion engine. Next 100 years is going to be the age of anything but the internal combustion engine.
Yep.
Your car, you've got a Hyundai 5, I think you said?
Yeah.
So one of the major car magazines just did a review on that within the last few months and said, why would you buy a Tesla when there's this Hyundai available? That's a very,
I know.
I
read the review in Car and Driver, and that's why I bought the car. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're running out of time.
Yeah.
But anyway, the market on used Teslas now, you can get them for $25,000 to $30,000 with low miles because there are so many options. So, and the reason to get a Tesla, they got a great charging network. I wanted to talk about Elon.
I'm sorry, Maverick. We're out of time. Good talking to you. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Welcome back, 9 minutes before the hour. Jake in Portland. Hey, what's up? Jake?
Hey, can you hear me?
No, Jake. Kevin in Durham, North Carolina. Hey, Kevin, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. So I think I found a new reason to like MLK Day. I get to see all these Republicans get dunked on for their MLK tweets.
Yeah.
So I saw Governor Ron DeSantis was getting dunked on because he's out there saying, "Happy MLK Day." And then Sarah Huckabee Sanders, I had to respond to her because her first order of business as governor of Arkansas was to ban CRT. And so today, she's out here tweeting about the Little Rock Nine. So I had to respond, and I said, I'm pretty sure this tweet qualifies as CRT, which you just banned in your state.
Did you get a response?
No. I mean, they never respond. I mean, I troll a lot of these guys. They don't never say anything.
Well, and
it's the word woke, I mean, well, speaking of the word woke, these people on Twitter saying woke, I always respond by saying define woke. And, of course, they never can, or they refuse to, because we all know what they really mean by that.
Well, it's like the word liberal back in the 80s and 90s, same deal. We don't know what it is, but we sure know it's bad.
Yeah. But anyway, I just had to share that. I just thought that was,
I think it's a good one, Kevin. Also, I do all my own social media. Everything that we post, Louise and I together work out the Facebook posts, and I do all the Twitter and Mastodon and Post and tribal stuff myself. But a lot of people like, presumably Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Ron DeSantis, they've got people who do that for them, and they're probably never even reading those tweets and feeds. So, but you know, still, you need to be pushing back, and good on you for doing it. Kevin, thanks a lot for the call. Jeannie in Birmingham, Alabama. Hey, Jeannie.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I wanted to say something about Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
This knows the child within him with an imaginary dream, a goal, an accomplishment. He has overcome his fear. Are you there?
I am. I'm listening.
Oh.
Don't listen to your radio or TV because there's a delay and it'll totally disorient you.
All right.
That's why Joyce told you to turn it down.
About Elon.
Yeah.
Look, he's willing to go into the unknown.
Into the what?
He has made mistakes. We all do. He's a man. But he wants to change the world. And he stood somebody better, okay? Because ever since Elephant Trunk Nose Nixon, I kind of knew the content, so to speak, of the final battle, like a Hitlerist regime. And, hey, you know, the food chain industry is killing us. The economy is a slot machine. It's rigged. The judicial system.
I get it. Jeannie, it's a great rant. I'm going to stop you right there, though. It's and move along. Bobby in La Puente, California. Hey, Bobby, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Happy New Year to you, Louise, and your crew there, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you. And back to you, Bobby, and I'm forgetting your wife's name.
Vivian.
Vivian, that's right.
Vivian.
Yeah. Forgive me.
All right.
My apologies, Vivian.
Yeah, no. No forgiveness. Anyway, MLK, had to remember it. My daughter came home, 9-year-old, drew a picture. Did he explain what Martin Luther King was about? Yeah, he had a dream. No, it was a vision. He had a vision of his crossing over. He went over to the other side. That's why he had no fear. So we have to, use his example. He marched for poverty and jobs. And to me, Tom, would solve this nation, unionize. But you had the other side. I don't know what they're afraid of. What's wrong with equality, equal treatment, respect one another? Not until I got in the union, and I break a broken record. I keep bringing up the union. That's where I got my respect, dignity, and saved my life. Without it, dead-end jobs like a lot of us in our Chicano neighborhood, poverty, drinking, drugging. So Martin along with Jackie Robinson, right? Gandhi, all those people. Jesus were hung on the cross or, executed for what? Talking peace and love. So we have to display it in our own homes. It starts at home. So with my granddaughter, I am proud of her. Maybe she has a chance, maybe to college, like a lot of us didn't. And I'm grateful to public schools that they, educate the young people. And not only Martin Luther or Indigenous, Jackie Robinson. Man, I get emotional, Tom. So there is hope. Yeah. And you're one of those beacon in the light. So I thank you so much and your crew from our family to yours. And I mean it. And I speak from the heart. And thank the audience as well in educating me.
You always do speak from the heart, Bobby, and I appreciate that, and your kind comments and your calls, and yeah, this is a time in American history, I think, when throughout our history we've needed to have compassion and we've needed to understand those things, but I think it's more urgent now than ever before. Bobby, thank you so much for the call. And your point about unions is so spot on. I mean, I saw that when I was a little tiny kid. When I was 5-6 years old, my dad went from selling encyclopedias and World Book encyclopedias and Rexair vacuum cleaners door to door to working in a tool and die shop, getting a good union job. And it changed our lives. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways to interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stokely, A Life by Peniel E. Joseph. This is from the preface. Stokely Carmichael is a troubling icon of America's civil rights years. His Black Power call became a national Rorschach test. Whereas many blacks viewed it as righteous, many whites saw violent foreboding. Newspapers brooded over Carmichael's words, quickly forming a consensus that judged the slogan to be at best intemperate and at worst a blatant call for anti-white violence and reverse racism. In 1966, Black Power reverberated around the world, galvanizing blacks, outraging whites, and inspiring a cross-section of ethnic and racial minorities. In 1969, Carmichael left the United States for Conakry, Guinea, where he reinvented himself as a roving Pan-Africanist organizer and professional revolutionary. For the next 30 years, he remained an energetic dissident, a throwback to the heady years of the 1960s. Carmichael turned the quest for black political power into his life's work. His faith in a style of politics many considered anachronistic came out of the same tenacity and stubbornness that once made him one of the most effective and controversial activists of his generation. These same qualities, however, limited Carmichael's efforts as a Pan-Africanist political mobilizer. Before leaving America, Stokely resigned as Black Power's glamorous enfant terrible. Telegenic, brash, equal parts angry and gregarious. Whether dressed in three-piece suits, leather jackets, sharecroppers' overhauls, or African dashikis, Carmichael became to represent the era's multifaceted identity. A hipster hero whose easy grace allowed him to consort effortlessly with both the dignified and the damned. The name Stokely Carmichael first came into my consciousness when I was a young boy coming of age in New York City. As the proud son of a Haitian mother who belonged to local 1199 Hospital Workers Union, part of SEIU, I grew up hearing stories of how civil rights activists, Black Power revolutionaries, Pan-Africanist freedom fighters, and trade unionists helped to shape a new world in America and beyond. By the time I was in elementary school, I was on my first picket line, accompanying my mother in support of an 1199 strike. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King supported 1199 during the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael's political importance came into sharper focus when I was in junior high after the premiere of the landmark PBS documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which featured the 24-year-old Carmichael's fiery Black Power speech and rightly characterized Stokely as his generation's heir to Malcolm X. Over the course of a decade of research on Carmichael, I would come to understand him as that and much more. Carmichael's youth, casual dress, and charisma made him an easily identifiable hero, one whose quick smile and passionate speeches left an indelible impression. An adopted son of the South by way of Trinidad, the Bronx, and Harlem, Stokely adapted while transforming whatever environment he encountered. As a native New Yorker growing up in the city's tense racial climate of the 1980s, I found Carmichael's survival instincts appealing. As a young graduate student in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to hear him speak and briefly met him afterward. He encouraged me to stay committed to the Black freedom movement, a struggle he defined as infinite. With his flowing African robes, gray hair, and white beard, he looked like a prince. and he had changed his name. He was no longer Stokely Carmichael. As Malcolm Little had become Malcolm X and later El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Stokely had become Kwame Ture. It was a name that paid homage to his two African heroes, men who had been the first presidents of their countries, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sekou Touré. Kwame Ture spelled the Guinean's name not as the French did, as white Europeans did, but as Arabs and Muslims did. Sekou Touré, S-E-K-U-T-U-R-E. As a college student, Carmichael helped transform America by organizing sit-ins, demonstrations, and voter registrations during the Civil Rights Movement's heroic years, a period that roughly encompasses the decade between the 1954 Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, desegregation decision, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and has become enshrined in public memory through national holidays, films, commemorations, and monuments. Carmichael's deep sense of justice contributed to his evolution into Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary and anti-capitalist organizer who moved to West Africa and remained tenacious in the face of searing political setbacks. Carmichael ultimately judged America incapable of creating the free and just world he had struggled for as a young man. But despite living in Africa for the final 30 years of his life, Carmichael's legendary stature as a black power activist lingered even if many ignored his lasting contributions to civil rights struggles that included a bruising quest for the vote in the Deep South. Although today largely forgotten, Stokely Carmichael remains one of the protean figures of the 20th century, a revolutionary who passionately believed in self-defense and armed rebellion, even as he revered nonviolence. The book Stokely, A Life, by Peniel L. Joseph.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. I wanted to talk about this, kind of coming back to the theme that we've been talking about all day, which is, you know, it being Martin Luther King Day. Also, the status of race in the United States and the status and the use of race, specifically in you know, my mind into this issue as a political weapon by and large by the Republican Party, and what happens as a result of that. You know, when Donald Trump came down his elevator at Trump Tower, his opening pitch to Republicans to become the Republican nominee for President of the United States, this back in the late spring, early summer of 2015. His pitch was that Mexicans are coming and they're rapists and murderers and they're bringing drugs and they want to get you and your kids. It's like a variation on, you know, Reagan's welfare queen and the young buck who uses food stamps in front of you in line, or Nixon's silent white majority that is concerned about law and order. And, you know, I mean, all these racist tropes, but Trump really took it from dog whistle to just, you know, bullhorn. And here we go. I mean, it's just like, this is, you know, example 6,312 in the last year or something like that. I mean, it's just 56-year-old Billy Davis stabbed an 18-year-old Indiana University out of this young woman is getting off the bus. Billy Davis is also female, and this 56-year-old woman, white woman, the young woman who was getting off the bus was Asian, and this white woman opens up a good-sized folding knife and starts stabbing her in the head, trying to kill her. And when she was arrested, she said that she did it because, quote, it would be one less person to blow up our country. In other words, she was saying that because this young Asian woman didn't look like her, she had to be eliminated. This is, you know, this is so pervasive in our culture. It has so become such a piece of our culture. Patrisse Cullors, was the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, and her cousin, Keenan Anderson, 31-year-old school teacher, right? This is a young man. 31. I suppose by some definition that's not young, but he's a father. He leaves behind a young child. He was working as an English teacher at the Digital Pioneers Academy. This is a school in Washington, D.C., a charter school in Washington, D.C. Previous to that, he had worked at a charter school in Watts in Los Angeles. This guy's a dedicated teacher. And he was visiting Los Angeles. And he got in a car accident. Now, a substantial percentage of black people who get killed by police because they were involved in car accidents. And I've got the statistic here. It'll take me a minute to find it, but I'll share it with you in a minute. I think it's like 1 in 5 or something like that, but it's just amazing. And so what did they do? Well, this is from The Guardian, the Sam Levin writing. Keenan was begging for help as multiple officers, keep in mind, he was in a car accident. He was dazed. He was in the streets. The cops came. They said, go over there and get, and he was saying, help me, call an ambulance. And instead of calling an ambulance, they said, get over there on the sidewalk and put your hands up against the wall. And he's, having a hard time just holding himself together. And so, well, back to The Guardian. I'll just give you the straight scoop here. He was begging for help as multiple officers held him down, and at one point he said, they're trying to George Floyd me. One officer had his elbow on Anderson's neck while he was laying down before another officer tased him for roughly 30 seconds straight before pausing and tasing him again for 5 more seconds. Get down on the ground now. Turn over on your stomach. And this is what the police said, the police officer said. And Anderson said, please help me. And then I don't know if there were bystanders or whatnot, but he said, they're trying to kill me, as multiple officers were holding him down. Quote, this is a quote from The Guardian. One of them placed his elbow and body weight on Anderson's neck while he was lying with his back on the ground. At this point, the officer standing above me shouted, turn over and I'm going to tase you. Anderson says, please help me. And instead they tased him to death. They tased him to the point where it induced a heart attack. Cullors, his cousin, who was the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, says it was a traffic accident. Instead of treating him like a potential criminal, police should have called the ambulance. And then The Guardian notes roughly 10% of killings by police each year start with a traffic encounter. So it's 1 in 10. I was thinking 1 in 5, but roughly 10% of police killings in the United States start with a traffic stop. Over at mappingpoliceviolence.us, police killed 1,185 people last year in 2022. Black people were 25% of those killed by police, even though they are 13% of our population. You are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people if you are black. You are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed than white people when you are killed by police. 98.1% of killings by police between the years 2013 and 2022, it's a 9-year period, 98.1% of those killings have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. And now on top of that, you've got Republicans taking Dr. King's words out of context and repurposing them to promote racism. I mentioned in the first hour of the program how when Tom Cotton, the right-wing Republican wannabe president from Arkansas, was in the Senate, was grilling a member of the armed forces, he demanded I don't know his demand, but he wanted them to stop diversity training in the military. Our military is too woke, don't you know? And what he offered to this guy in the military was, why don't you just play Martin Luther King's content of your character rather than color your skin speech? Well, first of all, I can guarantee you Tom Cotton hasn't listened to the entire speech, or he wouldn't have said that. But beyond that, I mean, this is just another example. Chip Roy, John Light's writing about this over at Talking Points Memo this morning. Representative Chip Roy, the guy who nominated Byron Donalds. Byron Donalds is a black Republican from Florida, I believe. Yeah, from a two-term representative from Florida, who opposes nonviolent demonstrations. He would have been opposed to Dr. King. And he opposes voting right protections. He would have been opposed to Dr. King. But this was the guy that they nominated to be Speaker of the House as a essentially token resistance against, and I use that word advisedly, against Kevin McCarthy. And when Chip Roy put his black man, to use Trump's phrase, up for that position, he said, and I quote, "For the first time in history, there have been 2 black Americans placed in a nomination for Speaker of the House. However, we do not seek to judge people by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character." BS. I mean, I call BS. Donalds, the guy that he had just nominated, had voted along with 146 other traitors to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Donald's support of Ron DeSantis's laws to make it harder to vote in Florida, in and of itself should have disqualified him from being associated in any way with Dr. King. John Light writes, use of Dr. King's words, especially by right-wing conservatives, are too often attempts to weaponize his memory against the multicultural democracy of which King could only dream. Now, John Light wrote a book. It's called The Struggle for the People's King, How Politics Transforms the Memory of the Civil Rights Movement. And he says, in my book, I show that there is a direct line from distortions of King's words and legacy to right-wing attempts, multicultural democracy and contemporary politics. These misuses of King, he writes, are not accidental. He says the GOP's sanitized version only comprises King's vision of a colorblind society at the expense of the deep systemic change that King believed was needed to achieve a society in which character was more important than race. And then he goes on, this is just, I've got to get this guy's book and read it, John Light, the guy who wrote this, because he notes throughout the 1980s, right-wing social movements, from the gun rights movement to the so-called family values coalitions to nativists and white supremacists, have all deployed King's memory to claim that they were the new minorities fighting for their own rights. These groups claimed that white Christians were the real victims of multicultural democracy and, in fact, were, quote, the new blacks. He says this false version of social reality eventually evolved into the Great Replacement theory, which is now being pushed by Fox News and Tucker Carlson, that says that white existence is under threat. He writes, in these distortions, gun rights activists call themselves the new Rosa Parks. Yes, they actually did. They called themselves Rosa Parks. The anti-abortion activists declared themselves freedom riders. Yes, they used that phrase. And anti-gay groups claimed themselves protectors of King's Christian vision. Well, King was a Christian. He must have been against homosexuality, don't you know? Right. He notes, John Light notes, over time, these political strategies had powerful effects and generated what appears, in my view, as an alternative social reality that for many white Americans begins to feel like the only reality. And this is where we're at. We have hardcore right-wing Christian nationalists, white supremacists, people who believe that only Christians should run this country, that Christian law should define this country, or even Catholic law, banning abortion and birth control, should define this country, and that only white people should have power in pretty much any circumstance. Using the words of Dr. King to try to justify, to rationalize their positions. And their supporters are lapping it up because we have allowed now for all these years for this sanitized, Disney-fied version of Dr. King to be the only version that's really out. It's a tragedy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Dr. King was a radical. We need radicals. We need more radicals in our society. We'll be right back. And welcome back. AJ in La Mesa, California. Hey, AJ, what's on your mind today?
Tom, Happy New Year. Glad you're doing well.
Thank you. Back at you.
From the horrific to the sublime, wanted to pick up on color photography, in particular the work of cinematographer Jack Cardiff, C-A-R-D-I-F-F, was British and was known as the master of Technicolor. If you do a quick web search, or your listeners do a quick web search, you'll bring up all sorts of hits, including an article from the Boston Globe from 2009, the year of his passing, titled Jack Cardiff, Cameraman Who Mastered Technicolor. And Wikipedia, they have a listing of the films that he worked on, in particular of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, and hopefully people will be moved to look up their films. In particular, A Matter of Life and Death, 1946, Black Narcissus, 47, The Red Shoes, 48, all of which Cardiff worked on. He also shot The African Queen for John Huston.
Wow, with Humphrey Bogart.
With Humphrey Bogart and
Lauren Bacall, wasn't it?
Or
was it Katharine Hepburn?
Katharine Hepburn, yes, and Robert Morley. And he later in life, he became a director, and he worked on a picture that's kind of a neat film called The Long Ships with Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier. Mm-hmm. But Cardiff was just a remarkable man, and there's a documentary that was made in 2009 called Cameraman, and if you add YouTube and Cameraman to your search parameter, it will bring up the YouTube documentary, or well, documentary posted at YouTube runs an hour 27 seconds, and it's delightful. So for cinephiles, this who are not familiar with his work and the films he worked on, this will be a treasure trove.
Sounds fascinating. Thank you for that, AJ. Thanks for adding to the contributing to the conversation. I appreciate it. Kurt in Akron, Ohio. Hey, Kurt. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
You were talking about woke and racism in this country, and real quickly, my great-grandmother once told me 100 years ago, because I actually remember my great-grandmother. She died in 1996. When she married my great-grandfather back in 1922, which happened to be the first Flag Day that they got married on, she converted from Methodist to Catholicism living in Massillon, Ohio. Well, her father and her brothers were in the Tuscarawas County Ku Klux Klan at the time.
Oh, my.
And they burned a cross on her front lawn because if you know your history, Catholics, Jews, and blacks were hated by the Klan.
Yep.
And like I told your
Kennedy was our first Catholic president.
Yes, I know. And Al Smith was our first. And Al Smith was our first Democratic candidate for president.
Who was Catholic?
But anyway, yep. And what I was telling your screener was, I don't deny that ever happened in my family history. I'm not ashamed of it in the sense that I had nothing to do with something that happened 5 decades before I was born, but I'm happy that I'm aware of it because that way I know what I need to do in order to keep that from ever happening again if I can.
Right. Yeah. Strong argument for teaching history, in other words.
Right. And then, of course, I had a Jewish teacher who tried teaching or wanted to teach Holocaust.
Kurt, I'm sorry, your phone just fell apart there for a second, but thank you for the call. An excellent point about the history of the Klan. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Welcome back. So I came across this really troubling story on a Ukrainian website. It's Hromadske, HROMADSKE.UA. And it's titled 700,000 Children Were Taken to Russia, Why Russia Needs Ukrainian Children and What Chances of Returning Them Home Are. And they start out the story with the story of this one family in Kharkiv. And, well, in fact, they know it. On August 31st, Russian journalists reported on the website Cuban 24 that children from the liberated districts of Kharkiv Oblast, Oblast is the state or the county, I guess, arrived at the Medvezhonk camp in the village of Kabarinka near Gelenzing. In other words, children from Ukraine were arriving at a camp in Russia. This is what what they said on Russian television. Quote, among us, there are children of different ages, children who need additional rehabilitation, psychological rehabilitation. Some have been through a lot. And we really want them to spend these 21 days, which start today, in a very happy childhood. And in the story, Russians promise Ukrainian children dancing, games, entertainment, and of course, the rehabilitation that they need after being through the trauma of war. They're 1,000 miles away from home. They've been separated from their parents. They go on to note, but in September, when the Ukrainian military began to liberate the occupied Kharkiv Oblast, the Russian TV channel NTV published another story that Ukrainian children should return home, but they can't go there now. Why? Because there's a war. They tell the story of Olha, she and her husband lived in this village in the Volkshansk rayon, an area near the Russian border, and how the Russians came in and convinced her to send her 12-year-old daughter to the camp, and how this is happening all over Ukraine. Many of these children are not taken voluntarily. They're taken by force. Some of them are literal orphans. But it appears that, we've been hearing stories out of Ukraine and fairly well documented now, particularly out of some of the cities that have been liberated, of Russian soldiers being explicitly told to use rape as a weapon of war, or at the very least being given permission to rape anybody that they wanted, and many cases of even children being raped by these Russian soldiers. Well, now, the portal Children of War suggests that there's more than 10.5 thousand Ukrainian children who have been taken to Russia. Oksana Filiponisha says the deportation, access to the occupied territories is limited, so the real scale may be much larger. Probably more than 700,000 children could be taken to Russia. This includes children who were deported to Russia from boarding schools, occupied cities and villages, from destroyed Mariupol, as well as those that were taken to the camps. And then they go on to note, Russians deport Ukrainian children from the occupied territories. This violates the norms of the international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, and this is genocide. On May 30th, Putin issued an act simplifying the granting of Russian citizenship to children from occupied regions. As soon as our children are granted Russian citizenship, they can automatically be adopted, and the adoptive parents have the right to change the child's surname, name, date, and place of birth. That is, to erase from legal documents all biological identification or links to their roots. And notes that this is clearly a violation of the Geneva Convention. Meanwhile, here in America, you've got, QAnon still talking about Comet Pizza and, Hillary Clinton.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is how this bizarre alternative reality that we're living in right now on the hard right is. We'll be right back.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, and today we're reading from Arundhati Roy's brilliant book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story. This is from the afterword, at the very end of the book. Yesterday morning, the police cleared Zuccotti Park, but today the people are back. The police should know that this protest is not a battle for territory. We're not fighting for the right to occupy a park here or there. We're fighting for justice. Justice is not just for the people of the United States, but for everybody. What you've achieved since September 17th, when the Occupy movement began in the United States, is to introduce a new imagination, a new political language into the heart of the empire. You reintroduced the right to dream into a system that tried to turn everybody into zombies, mesmerized into equating mindless consumerism with happiness and fulfillment. As a writer, let me tell you, this is an immense achievement. I cannot thank you enough. We are talking about justice. Today, as we speak, the Army of the United States is waging a war of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. U.S. drones are killing civilians in Pakistan and beyond. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops and death squads are moving into Africa. If spending trillions of dollars of your money to administer occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan is not enough, a war against Iran is being talked up. Ever since the Great Depression, the manufacture of weapons and the export of war have been key ways in which the United States has stimulated its economy. Just recently, under President Obama, the United States made a $60 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. It hopes to sell thousands of bunker busters to the United Arab Emirates. It has sold $5 billion worth of military aircraft to my country, India, my country, which has more poor people than all the poorest countries of Africa put together. All these wars, from the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to Vietnam, Korea, Latin America, have claimed millions of lives, all of them to secure the, quote, American way of life, end quote. Today we know that the American way of life, the model that the rest of the world is meant to aspire toward, has resulted in 400 people owning the wealth of half the population of the United States. It has meant thousands of people being turned out of their homes and jobs while the U.S. government bailed out banks and corporations. American International Group alone was given $182 billion in the bailout. The Indian government worships U.S. economic policy. As a result of the free market economy, today 100 of India's richest people own assets equal to a fourth of the country's GDP, while more than 80% of Indian people live on less than 50 cents a day. 250,000 farmers driven into a spiral of death have committed suicide. We call this progress and now think of ourselves as a superpower. Like you, we are well qualified, we have nuclear bombs and obscene inequality. The good news is that people have had enough and are just not going to take it anymore. The Occupy movement has joined thousands of other resistance movements all over the world in which most people are standing up and stopping the richest corporations in their tracks. Few of us dreamed that we would see it, the people of the United States on our side, trying to do this in the heart of empire. I don't know how to communicate the enormity of what this means. The 1% say we don't have demands. They don't know, perhaps, that our anger alone would be enough to destroy them. But there are some things, a few pre-revolutionary thoughts I had for us to think about together. We want to put a lid on this system that manufactures inequality. We want to put a cap on the unfettered accumulation of wealth and property by individuals as well as corporations. As capitalists and Liddites, we demand, 1, an end to cross-ownership in business. For example, weapons manufacturers cannot own TV stations. Mining corporations cannot run newspapers. Business houses cannot fund universities. Drug companies cannot control public health funds. 2, natural resources and essential infrastructure, water supply, electricity, health, and education cannot be privatized. 3, everybody must have a right to shelter, education, and health care. 4, the children of the rich cannot inherit their parents' wealth. This struggle has reawakened our imagination. Somewhere along the line, capitalism reduced the idea of justice to mean just human rights. The idea the idea of dreaming of equality became blasphemous. We're not fighting to tinker with reforming a system that needs to be replaced. As a capist and a Lidite, I salute your struggle. Salam and Zimbad Dad. That's the end of the book. This is the very opening of it, chapter 1. Is it a house or a home, a temple to the new India, or a warehouse for its ghosts? Ever since Antilla arrived in Altamont Road in Mumbai, exuding mystery and a quiet menace, things have not been the same. Here we are, the friend who took me there said. Pay your respects to our new ruler. Antilla belongs to India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. I'd read about this most expensive dwelling ever built, the 27 floors, 3 helipads, 9 lifts, hanging gardens, ballrooms, weather rooms, gymnasiums, 6 floors parking, and 600 servants. Nothing had prepared the vertical lawn. a soaring 27-story high wall of grass attached to a vast metal grid. The grass was dry in patches. Bits have fallen off in neat rectangles. Clearly, trickle down hadn't worked. But gush up certainly has. That's why in a nation of 1.2 billion, India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. And the Arundhati Roy goes on from the talking about India is kind of an example of capitalism run amok. Capitalism, a ghost story by Arundhati.
Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. Our podcast, The Hartmann Report, is absolutely free and available wherever fine podcasts are available. And the entire 3-hour podcast is available over at thomhartmann.com. So Congressman Joe Walsh was on CNN the other day talking about the liberal media bias. And he's a former Republican. I mean, I think they actually believe this stuff. And I don't know how they can believe it when they know. I mean, Joe Walsh, of all people, would know that there are 1,500, more or less, right-wing radio stations in America and a handful of progressive radio stations. For example, Twitter's own internal study found that in 6 out of 7 nations, the exception being Germany, tweets from right-wing politicians received more amplification from the algorithm than those from the left. And right-leaning news organizations were more amplified than those on the left. That's a quote from their own study. The Media Matters did a study. 8.8% of Sunday show guests are liberal. 48.5% tilt to the right. Tell me about this again. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. "35 minutes past hour." Welcome back. Jim in Red Hook, New York. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Hey, how are you doing? I actually called in when you were talking about slavery, and I want to just point to what I think is, the most troubling example of slavery today, which is cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Right.
I'm sure you know about it.
I do.
It's incredible. Like, it's an environmental disaster. It's women working with infants on their backs for $1 a day, sometimes $0.
Many of those people are young children too.
Exactly. Yeah, kids working, and it's all happening there. So Apple and Tesla are the primary beneficiaries of it. We're all beneficiaries. It's in our phone, but it's mostly in our electric cars. So I just want people to be cognizant of it and start talking about it. So I'm glad I have an opportunity to raise it. Thank you.
And there are alternatives.
The Tesla drivers. What's that?
And there are alternatives. I mean, there are rare earth deposits around the world that are not exploited, in large part because that cobalt from that part of the world is so cheap because of the slave labor.
Right. And, so I think 2 companies changing their practices, could make a huge difference. And will they? Who knows? But it's worth a discussion to begin moving them in that direction.
There you go. Jim, thank you. Thanks for listening to WIOF there in Red Hook, New York. Ronald in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Ronald, what's on your mind today?
Hello. Yes, a while ago, a woman called about talking about James Earl Ray didn't kill Martin Luther King. And I remembered reading a book about that. And so I just thought I'd call in.
Was that book by Sheriff, what was his name? There was a sheriff who wrote a book about that years ago.
William F. Pepper.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Pepper. Yeah, I've met him and spoken with him.
Was he on your show before?
He's not. I don't know if he's been on the show or not, but I know that I've had several conversations with him back when Lamar and I were researching the JFK book. He was deep into that, and there's some information about MLK in our book Legacy of Secrecy. It deals with the assassinations of both JFK, RFK, and MLK.
I took his book out of the library a number of years ago, called Active State, and it's chock full of information. And it said the closest he could get was that James Earl Ray was too drunk on the day to assassinate Martin Luther King, and it was actually a guy in next door in the diner. He went out the back door of the diner, and he was like a former policeman named Clark or something. He was a marksman, and he shot.
Right, and there's a theory that Ray was actually Potter.
Could have been.
Yeah.
But I just looked. I Googled it, and you can get the book on Apple Books for $2.99.
Yeah. There you go.
Back to state.
Yeah, Dr.
William
Pepper did some pretty good, in some cases controversial, but some pretty good research. Ronald, thanks for the call, and thanks for sharing that. John in Hillsboro, Oregon. Hey, John, what's up?
Hi. I've kind of watched a lot of war documentaries. I got burned out on it, but one thing I came across in my mind when I was watching this, the 118th Congress try to get their leader, McCarthy. And what I kind of came to a conclusion, just referencing, the 20th century politics internationally, that the Bolsheviks and the Nazis were very much in a minority in their, what you want to call Duma or Parliament, and they still took over.
Yep.
And so when I saw MJT call Trump immediately after they got McCarthy up there, I kind of got a flashback, of Lenin, Goebbels, and I just see this whole thing turning to a dystopian, society in 24 months. Because Trump is still calling the shots, and so are the billionaires. And they have 20 people in the 118th Congress that has everybody by the throat. And so that's why my anxiety is, because I see this is not going to turn out very well at all.
Yeah. I share your concerns, John. I'm not going to get anxious about it, but because I'm just not a fan of letting Republicans control my emotions. But I do share your concerns, and
well, it's not so much the Republicans; it's the system.
Yeah.
And it's been overhauled and hijacked by billionaires and radical people.
Well, the original, what facilitated that was two Supreme Court decisions in 1976 and 78, Buckley versus Vallejo and First National Bank versus Bellotti. And in those two decisions, in 76, they said that if wealthy individuals want to pour cash down the throat of a politician, that's no longer considered bribery or political corruption. That's now called free speech, because money is speech, don't you know? And then 2 years later, in a decision written by Lewis Powell himself, in Boston versus Bellotti, the First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, they concluded that that's true for corporations also, because corporations are persons. And then in 2010, on the Citizens United decision, and again, these decisions, there were at least one or two Democratic appointees who voted in the very first case, in the Buckley case, but all the rest of them were all Republican appointees to the Supreme Court, saying, yeah, we just think everybody, anybody should be able to buy a politician in America. And, this paved the way for the Reagan Revolution, and it's gone on steroids in the era since 2010, since Citizens United. And that's the original sin, as it were, in the modern era with regard to the corruption of our politics, John. John, thanks for the call, and thanks for pointing this stuff out. George in Lake Elsinore. Hey, George, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to Sirius XM.
Well, Tom, I was very glad to hear that piece by Jefferson, but I also want to bring up the fact that our military, they're suffering because of the fact of food insecurity. And part of what King was in Memphis for was to talk about money, and everybody forgets about that because he was focused on economic justice.
Yep.
But I want to go to the fact of the matter that I'm a veteran, and I've been an advocate through America's Disabled Veterans in Action for the last 10 years. And one of the things I've always focused on is that the men and women who in our military go in, and currently out of high school, you start at $2.63 an hour. When you take their base pay and you divide it into 4 parts, and you divide that by 168 hours because they're on call 24/7, they're being paid at the rate of $2.63 an hour. To give the minimum wage of $7.50, you have to make E9, and that takes about 10 years to get there. The fact of the matter is that it's often an inducement into slavery. It's poverty. And these people are expected to pop around the world within 23 hours, be anywhere in the world. And they don't have enough food to even feed their families. And then when you bring this to the military officials through the DAV or whatever, and they're like, oh, no, that's not true. It's been revised $1,000 a year. The disabled vets don't get $40,000 a year, even at 100%. They're just barely there, like 39,000. But the bottom line is that these people are in poverty, and it's like a lot of times they're minorities, they're the poor, and they are looking for employment of the last resort, and they go into the military and they get impoverished, and it's hard to shake. You know, you give up your health, you give up your youth, and then you end up, you know, still suffering and maybe even homeless.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that nobody addresses this. They put billions of dollars into weapons and everything else, and they don't do anything for the man and woman that are actually there to do the job.
Yeah,
that's my point today.
I believe that was, you're echoing a rant that Ro Khanna went off on last Friday, if I'm remembering correctly, where, you know, he was like, you know, yeah, we should raise military pay. We just don't need to pour more money into the military-industrial complex. George, thank you.
Listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
It's 45 minutes past the hour here on your media support group for We the People. Back with your calls right after this. And welcome back. John in Seattle. Hey, John, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Happy Martin Luther King's Day.
Thank you.
In Seattle, they're having a rally at Garfield High School, and they're going to do a march at 12:30. They've been meeting there since 11 o'clock. But they're going to do a rally. So we're having a march, and it should be pretty good. I just wanted to give a shout out to Marvin Gaye, the black singer, and the song was What's Going On? And to me, that's a beautiful song to play today on Martin Luther King's Day for your celebration. And Ella Fitzgerald, when she could sing as well. So it's a day of rejoicing, music. With all the prejudice out there, it's sad. Also, getting into film, I think the beginning of the hatred started with D.W. Griffith when he came out with the movie called The Birth of a Nation. And that's when all of a sudden there became a lot of hangings. And the gentleman who became...
It wasn't all of a sudden, John, but it was certainly a revival of the Klan. I mean, that movie was basically a Klan recruiting film, and when Woodrow Wilson played it in the White House, it just went viral, to use a
Yes, it did. And the man who went against that and didn't like it became a filmmaker named Oscar Musho. He's a black filmmaker, famous black filmmaker, and his movies were Body and Soul and Within Our Gates and Murder in Harlem. And Exit was his first talking movie. But he put realism in black film and made people, black people see the reality of what was happening in the country. And so his movies actually counterdicted D.W. Griffith's movies, and became more important in the history of black film.
He's not the guy that the Oscars were named after, is he?
Oscar Musho.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Nate says no, so Nate would know. Thank you.
Pardon? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's. Well, he's a hero, and but yeah, I think things are going to. Today is a beautiful day, and that song "What's Going On" with Marvin Gaye is so perfect for the occasion. So it answers a lot of questions, and good music, soul music, like Stevie Wonder, and I mean, this country could not be a country without black people. Period. So, there's a lot of realism there. They'll learn the hard way, but history really is important to learn about what's going on.
This is why people like Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis are working so hard to stop the teaching of history in our public schools.
Yeah, and the other one I could say, well, I think that the opposite of they keep saying woke, whatever. The opposite of that to me is wake up.
Yeah, or asleep. Yeah, yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, I get your point. John, thank you. Thanks for the call. It's 49 minutes past the hour. Back with more of your calls in just a moment. Stick around. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Welcome back. Picking up your calls. Kitty in Fullerton, California. Hey, Kitty, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's up?
Yes, I'm glad the last person just mentioned the word woke. And I don't know why we are allowing the Republicans to demonize that word and call our famous people woke, and that's supposedly a derogatory word. I think we should start calling the Republicans not just asleep, but comatose.
Yeah.
They need to. Well,
it's a willful.
Need to embrace this.
Yeah, it's on their part though. It's a willful lack of recognition of reality. So maybe delusional would be a better word, except that even delusional is typically not willful. Hypocritical, I guess, would be the best word. But Kitty, excellent point. Excellent point. Thank you very much for calling and making it. Brenda in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Hey, Brenda, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's up?
Thank you for taking my call. I was calling about the fact that I hear so many people that want this to be a Christian nation, but they act very ignorant to the second greatest commandment of all. To me, when Martin Luther spoke, he spoke about basically the second greatest commandment. Don't give us more. Just treat us the way you would want to be treated. Treat everyone that way. And as far as when I come across people who, they go on the, you want to be woke or whatever, I don't say anything more to them other than, well, you have your history, your family history. Would you want your history known? And then they kind of think about it for a minute. I can't change people, but I can try to make them think about what they're saying and doing. Because if we do not have our history, and that's all of our history, everyone that's been in this America, every nationality, race, whatever, that is our history, and that's what helps us go forward. And if we can't learn it, then we're just going to stay stuck in a horrible position where we do not even honor the second greatest commandment. I say I'm trying to be a Christian, but when I hear so many people talk about Christianity, and yet it's like they're absolutely, completely ignorant of the first and second greatest commandment, and that was for everyone.
Right, yeah.
That's all I had to say.
Well, thank you, Brenda. You said it very well, and for people who might confuse that with the Ten Commandments, Jesus was asked, what do we have to do? And he said the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. And you're absolutely right. Very, very well said. Brenda, thank you. Tony in Atlanta. Hey, Tony, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. How you doing, man?
Good. What's up?
Good to be a part of the show. All right. Well, yeah, it's a great day, but it's also a great day to acknowledge that in 1860, 4.4 million people were enslaved in America. A little bit over, about 160 years ago, 4.4 million people, but 4 million were enslaved. So my thing is right now the income gap is for every medium. It's for every dollar that the white household has, it's 10 cents for black. So, but Tom, I'm under the impression that even though we know this is this disparity and it's based on the fact that we were enslaved, it feels like that if you try to get that $1 to 30 cents, that's reason for war in America. I'm for real, because they don't want to do anything. It's almost like they've had their, you know how when you don't want to hear nobody talking, you put your hand over your ears? That's kind of like how they've done us over that time. But my initial call was because for right now, we tend to put us in a class. We're the only race that gets mentioned in a class. They say, taking nothing away from anybody. They say blacks and gays, blacks and this and that. But we're the only race. But when you go fill out a form for any government form, it don't have those other classes. So why are we the only race that's put with a class? I can't understand.
By class, what do you mean?
Well, they refer to us as not a race, but a minority. You understand what I'm saying? So they will mix us in with blacks and other minorities, and But like I say, those are the things that you hear in the public vernacular when people talk on radio and whatever. But that's not nothing that you're going to see on official government forum. So I think that we do a disservice by allowing that into the vernacular to be put in the class. We are racist.
No, I get it. I got it. Thank you. Excellent point. Thank you. George in Cripple Creek, Virginia. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Happy New Year to you, Louisiana. You mentioned Russians using rape in Ukraine. Well, that goes back at least a century. World War II, Stalin gave the Red Army free rein to rape once they entered German territory. And have you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's August 1914?
I have not.
Well, when the Tsar's army invaded East Prussia in August 1914, they raped, pillaged, and plundered scores of German towns and villages. So that goes back at least a century, using rape as a tactic. Yeah. So that's a tried and true Russian army tactic.
Well, it's also a tried and true tactic of war more generally.
Definitely, yes.
I mean, this probably goes back to the early dawn of human history, but it's a crime. It's a war crime, and it should be prosecuted. Hopefully, will be prosecuted. Yeah.
Definitely, I hope so. We'll keep up the good work.
Thank you, George. Good talking to you. Appreciate the call. Melvin in Huntsville, Texas. Hey, Melvin. Thanks for listening to Sirius XM.
Hey,
what's up?
Yes. Listen, this conversation about race, this is a pet peeve of mine. Number one, race is a social construct. There really is nothing. There's no such thing as race. It's made up.
Yeah, tell that to a white cop when he pulls you over.
When I fill out forms and they have race on there, I go to other and I write human. Okay. Who can deny that I am human? Just because I have a tint of my skin, that does not make me different from anyone else. If I took a white guy and myself and we stood behind an X-ray machine and I had you on the other side, you didn't see where we were standing, and I asked you to pick one of us out, you couldn't do it. Race is BS, pretty much. And we need to get away from it immediately. We're all human. That's all that matters.
Yeah, Melvin, I don't know how this plays out in the black community, but more generally, but I can tell you among white people, the white people that I know who are saying race is meaningless and it's, we're all human race. What they're really saying is they like the status quo. They like white people in charge. They want to keep white people in charge. And please don't bother us with this conversation about race. I'm not attributing that perspective to you, Melvin, but I've heard that enough times to know that that's very much the case, particularly among the Republicans like Tom Cotton, who say, to the military, well, we shouldn't do diversity training because, shouldn't we judge people on the content of their character instead of the color of their skin? Yeah, right. Hey, thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. Audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Line, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.